Summary.
What do you do when your plane crashes in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness? Thankfully, Amelia is in luck. Caleb, a reclusive mountain man, finds her before she freezes to death. Now he must decide what to do with her since the plane that brings his supplies won't be back until summer.
Chapter 1.
Amelia gripped tightly to the handles of her seat as the single-engine aircraft bounced and shuddered, shaking on every axis. How could this be happening? She thought, looking down at the rapidly approaching landscape below. Mayday, 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 the pilot called over the radio as the plane dipped again, causing Amelia's stomach to lurch up. Billy, she yelled over the thumping and whining from the engines. Billy, what's wrong? I'm sorry, ma'am, he replied, glancing over at her, his eyes so dilated they looked entirely black. Looks like we're going down. The expression on his face told Amelia all she needed to know. He was petrified, all hope of surviving this gone, and if an Alaskan bush pilot this scared, she knew it was bad. What do we do? She called, wishing there was something, anything, that she could do that would give them just a few more minutes in the air. Brace yourself, he yelled, the muscles on his arms taut under the strain of trying to keep the plane in the air. And if you believe in God, he added, pray for us. Amelia closed her eyes, wishing there was some way she could have one more conversation with Dale. To tell him all the things in her heart, all the truths she'd been keeping to herself for far too long. Billy gave a blood-curdling roar as the plane slammed into the first tree. The impact snapped the left wing off the craft, sending it ass over tea-kettle down the side of the mountain. Amelia felt every bone-jarring impact, her body shaking like a rag doll. With each jolt she prayed that the end would come quickly. Dying slowly in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, was not something she wanted to think about. If she had to die, please let it be quick. Thankfully, on the next impact she was knocked unconscious, her head slamming into the bulkhead of the plane. She never felt her seat ripping itself from the frame of the aircraft, flinging her free of the burning wreckage, plunging through the trees and over outcroppings of rocks before sliding to a rest at the base of the mountain. Coming to later, Amelia found everything upside down, her head throbbing and her body aching. She was in a white wonderland, still strapped into her seat, what was left of it. With cold, aching fingers she fumbled at the latch, pinning her in, tears forming as she fought to free herself. It seemed an age before she was able to make the mechanism release her, sending her sliding further down the steep incline, her head hitting several hidden rocks on the way down. Seeing stars, Amelia managed to clamber to her feet, a wave of nausea overcoming her as she reached out with her left arm to steady herself on a nearby tree. Something was wrong. Her shoulder radiated with pain every time she tried to move it. Cradling it close, she blinked away the encroaching darkness that seemed to be trying to creep in at the corners of her vision. Perceiving nothing but whiteness in every direction, she decided to continue down the mountain, away from the wreckage, hoping it was the right thing to do. After walking for what seemed like hours, trying to stave off the exhaustion and nausea that caused her to vomit and dry heave more than once, that Amelia saw, of all things, what looked like a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. Stumbling forward, her throat too raw to even call out, she managed to reach the door. With the last of her strength she forced it open, falling into the cold, unlit interior. Dazed, Amelia managed to crawl inside, barely remembering to shut the door before burying herself in a pile of dingy fabric piled in one of the corners. Finally giving into the darkness that had been playing in her peripheral vision took over, sending her into a dreamless sleep.
Chapter 2.
Caleb Dulac loved living in the Brooks Mountains of the Alaskan bush. Their majestic snow-capped peaks, the lines of the world softened by foot after foot of white beauty, and the blessed silence. With that deep and abiding love came an understanding that when things went wrong, they went really wrong, and he had no one to turn to for help. Spending 11.5 months in the wild meant that the only things between him and certain death were his wits and being prepared. He'd begun his day as usual, checking and oiling his traps to prepare them for the upcoming winter season, and that he had enough bait for each of the animals he was seeking. Checking to make sure his storage shed was animal-proof, and that his dehydrated tanning supplies were placed well off the ground where they might get contaminated. Just his normal day-to-day routine. The one thing he hadn't planned on was the blade on his axe cracking in the middle of chopping wood. Well, shit happened out here and there was only one thing to do. Figure it out. With only 2 weeks out of every year spent in Anchorage, Caleb had become efficient in his purchasing of supplies and storing them. He had his main cabin at the lake so he could have ready access to the water. And the plane that picked him and his furs up and dropped him and his supplies off twice a year could land. He had 5 other smaller shacks spaced around this valley, each one he'd recently stocked and readied for hunting. Thankful that he knew where a ready replacement was, but cursing that he'd only left it there 3 days ago, Caleb sighed. It was a walk of 4 miles and 3 ridges away. and would take up the rest of the little sunlight he had left to get there, and only about half the way back before darkness would fall over the valley, making the trek more dangerous. He thought about putting the trip off until the next morning, but he already had a list of chores that needed to accomplish then, where he was done for the day except for chopping wood. Going to his cabin, Caleb grabbed his rifle, revolver, and snowshoes. He loaded his sled with a few supplies he needed to move anyway and set out into the half-light of the early Alaskan fall. The unfortunate side of the sunlight getting less and less each day was that the snow was no longer melting, it was just getting deeper and deeper. The going wasn't too bad as Caleb broke a trail into the fresh fallen snow. It hadn't been enough to obliterate his earlier path, but it did add a little more to his estimated time for getting out and back. If all else failed, the camp he was heading to had been well stocked with supplies that would make it easy to stay the night if he got too tired to make it back to his main cabin. Halfway along the trail, Caleb heard a resounding boom echoing across the mountain range, shaking snow off of the laden branches of the pines. Looking around, he saw nothing that could have made the sound. Despite his excellent hearing, the hills distorted the directionality of it. He couldn't pinpoint exactly where it had come from. Whatever it was, he hoped no one was injured. In this terrain they wouldn't last long without help. Shrugging, Caleb toiled on, intent on getting to the axe, but keeping a watchful eye out for whatever could have made the noise. After 5 hours of hiking, Caleb crested the last ridge and looked down at his camp. At first glance, everything looked as he'd left it a few days before, but as he got closer he began to notice signs that something had been moving around the small cabin. Shedding his pack and sled, Caleb drew his Bowie knife and his Smith & Wesson .500. He began to circle the perimeter slowly and quietly, looking for indications that the intruder was still there. Seeing no movement and hearing no animal sounds, he advanced inch by inch, keeping constant watch for the unseen invader. He could see where the snow had been tramped down and some dark staining that could be blood, but he still heard no sounds. Whatever it was had moved in such a way that there were no distinct prints to be seen. Perhaps it was an injured animal. As he reached the small cabin, Caleb paused, listening, but when he still heard nothing, using the tip of his knife to lift the latch, he slowly pushed the door open. Leading with his revolver, he stepped into darkness, ready to face whatever was there. In the dim light streaming through the door, he saw more blood smeared on the floor, leading to the far corner where there was a huddled mound of moldy tarps he used to wrap pelts in. Unable to tell what kind of animal it could be, Caleb stepped forward silently, readying for anything. Sheathing his blade, he kept his gun ready as he reached the mound, carefully using his free hand to pull the fabric back, trying to expose the creature underneath. There were no telltale smells of musk that would have indicated a bear, wolverine, or any other type of animal he would have expected to find, but the smell of blood was stronger. As he finally removed the last layer, Caleb was shocked to see not an animal, but a battered, bruised, and bloody female form hidden underneath. Not able to tell if she was dead or alive, Caleb knelt down and gently touched her throat, glad to find a slow but steady heart. Uncovering the woman completely, Caleb began a full-body assessment of her injuries, a technique he'd learned years before moving out to the bush when he'd been a state trooper. With just a field examination, he could tell her left shoulder was dislocated by the way it lay at an unnatural angle. It would need to be popped back into place and wrapped. There was a large gash on her forehead that was crusted with dried blood, dirt, and pine needles. Her clothing, what was left of it, was shredded and charred to a point that if she hadn't buried herself under the blankets he'd left here, she would have frozen to death within hours.
Chapter 3.
Once back at his main camp, Caleb carried the still unconscious woman inside and put her onto his bed. Leaving her momentarily, he quickly unloaded the sled, storing it away before going back to her side. With hands agile after years of trapping and skinning, he used one of his skinning knives to remove her clothes. Seeing a naked woman for the first time in almost 5 years stirred his groin painfully. Despite the cuts and bruises that crisscrossed her flesh, she was stunning, her lacy undergarments doing nothing to ease his lust. Shaking his head at such thoughts, Caleb fed his stove more wood, put a kettle full of water on it to warm, and grabbed his stock of first aid supplies. The woman's face was covered in small cuts and scratches, except the large gash that ran from her eyebrow to her hairline looked in need of stitches. Her torso, arms, and legs were covered with large, irregular bruises, and, as he'd thought, with her clothes off he could tell her shoulder was definitely dislocated. Crawling over her, trying in vain to ignore how soft her body was, Caleb lifted her arm into the air. Placing his foot into her armpit, he gave it one powerful jerk, feeling it pop back into its socket with a sickening, popping sound. The woman moaned slightly when he did this, but still did not wake. Crawling back over her, he rummaged through his supplies and found several rolls of fabric. Using these, he gently lifted the woman and carefully wrapped her arm to her chest, pinning it tightly in place to make sure it healed properly. He then began to assess the rest of her body. Placing his hands on her abdomen, he pressed gently to make sure her abdomen was soft and not full of blood or fluid. After a thorough exam, he found no other major injuries aside from the large gash on her forehead and her shoulder. Caleb took a large bowl from a shelf and filled it with hot water. He then took one of his few truly clean clothes and some soap powder to work up a lather before returning to the woman's side. Carefully, starting with her head, he washed her bruised and cut body all the way down to her toes. Thankfully, his emergency training had taken over and he was able to do so with detachment. When she was finally clean, he took two of his heaviest blankets and put them over her, making sure the edges were tucked in tightly around her. He hadn't dragged her 5 miles and worked so hard for her to die of exposure. Now he turned his full attention to the oozing laceration on her forehead. Pouring the dirty water out into the snow, Caleb filled the bowl again, adding more soap and set about stitching the wound closed. Upon closer inspection, as he deep cleaned the opening, he sent a thanks to whatever God had been watching over her when he saw that it wasn't as bad as he feared. While the cut was long, it didn't go as deep as he'd originally thought. Taking some thread and a needle from his mending kit, and opening one of his precious alcohol packs, Caleb cleaned them both thoroughly. After taking a deep, calming breath, he began to stitch, trying to make sure that there wouldn't be a horrible scar left behind when he was done. Thankfully, the woman remained unconscious for this procedure as well, making the job, if not easier, less stressful for him. When it was all over, Caleb allowed himself a deep swig of whiskey, which he usually only used for medicinal purposes. Taking a second gulp from the bottle, he looked down at the woman in his bed and wondered what had happened to her. There was no mark on her that indicated an animal attack, but that still didn't explain how she'd ended up in the middle of nowhere covered in cuts and bruises. Was that boom he'd heard a plane or helicopter crash? Had she somehow managed to survive and just coincidentally stumbled into his camp? That would explain a lot, but he knew he'd have to wait until she woke up to get the whole story from her. Gently stroking her across the top of the head, Caleb shook his head. What was he going to do with her? Sighing at the conundrum she presented, he set about making himself a place to sleep on the floor next to his own bed. If she woke in the night, he wanted to be able to stop her from wandering. Using the bare fur he'd wrapped her in to bring her here, extinguished all but one of his lanterns, knowing he'd need the light if she did waken, and lay down between his bed and the stove. Over the next 2 days, Amelia drifted in and out of consciousness, never truly aware of the world around her. Caleb checked on her hourly, readjusting the blankets if she had thrown them off, spooning water onto her parched lips and gently readjusting her body to prevent bed sores. On the 3rd day, Amelia finally awakened, thirsty and very confused. "Dale," she rasped, reaching into empty air for someone. "Hush," an unfamiliar voice said, as a rough, calloused hand took hers. "Hush," the voice repeated. "You're safe." "Dale," Amelia sobbed, wanting him to be there with her. "Dale isn't here," the voice said in a tone one would use on a child. "My name is Caleb. Where's Dale?" she begged, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," the voice soothed, stroking her forehead. "There wasn't anyone with you when I found you." Amelia looked in the direction of the voice, seeing a stranger's face obscured by a thick growth of dark facial hair. In fear, she tried to move away, but stopped at the jolt of pain radiating simultaneously from her left shoulder and forehead. "No, no," Caleb cautioned softly, "don't move. You dislocated your shoulder and I had to reset it." Amelia faltered, beginning to feel lightheaded. It's okay," the man said, again trying to soothe her. "You rest. In a little while we can talk more." Amelia nodded her agreement, too exhausted by their short conversation to argue.
Chapter 4.
When she woke again, Amelia felt a little stronger and slowly tried to move. At her grunt of pain, the man was at her side pushing bundles of something soft and rather smelly behind her back to keep her propped up. "Here," he said, "let me help." After making sure she was comfortable, Caleb left her side long enough to get her a mug of water. "You've been unconscious off and on for the last few days," Caleb said, holding the wooden vessel to her lips. "I wasn't sure if you were going to make it." Amelia coughed, the cold water burning its way down her parched throat. "Where am I? What hospital?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Caleb chuckled. "You're about 300 miles from the nearest hospital," he explained. "I found you half frozen in one of my satellite camps." Sipping a little more, Amelia tried to understand this scruffy, unkempt man sitting on a stool in front of her. "What?" she asked, trying to wrap her brain around what he was saying. Taking the cup back and refilling it, Caleb returned. I broke my axe a few days ago and couldn't repair it, he explained, sitting back down on a low stool. Thankfully I had a spare one up at the camp where I found you. If it hadn't been for that axe, he paused, pointing to it leaning in the corner, I wouldn't have found you for weeks. How did I get there? Amelia asked, still confused. Hell if I know, Caleb said, shrugging his shoulders, so let's start with what I do know. I found you 4 miles from here. You were pretty banged up, a cut on your head, a dislocated shoulder, and your clothes were torn up and singed pretty bad. Looking down, Amelia suddenly realized she was naked except for her underwear under the blanket that was barely covering her breasts. Pushing the cup back into his hand, she pulled it higher, closer to her shoulders. You took my clothes off, she asked, blushing deeply. There wasn't much left to take, Caleb said, holding up the shredded remains of her snow pants and parka. It looks like you walked through a meat grinder. Propeller blades, Amelia said, finally remembering what happened. I was on my way to, I think it's called Barrow. I work for a drilling company in Houston doing environmental surveys. I was on my way to do an impact study on a new natural gas drilling site before they started drilling. I was in a small 4-seater prop plane, and we started to have engine trouble. She paused, closing her eyes, trying to remember more. The plane started shaking, and the pilot started yelling, telling me to hang on. I remember a horrible crash and the crunching of metal, then I woke up still strapped in my seat. It took forever to unclasp myself, she continued, her green eyes going unfocused. When I finally got out, I slipped and rolled. I rolled forever. I got up and I didn't know where to go. I started walking because I didn't know what else to do. After a while I found a cabin, right there in the middle of nowhere. I guess I crawled in and passed out. Was Dale on the flight with you? Caleb asked, clasping his hands together in front of him. Dale? Amelia asked, confused at how he could know that name. Yeah, he replied, looking at her concerned. You called his name several times when you were delirious. No, she said, sighing, it was just me and the pilot. Well, that explains how you got here, Caleb said, nodding. I guess the biggest question is what to do with you now. What do you mean? Amelia asked. It's October, we're at the beginning of winter up here in Alaska, he explained. The plane that drops off my supplies won't be back until mid-July next year, so I can go into town and sell my furs. Which means I need to think of another way to get you out of here. Don't you have a car or something? Amelia asked. Listen, Caleb said firmly, but at the same time gently, taking the cup back. Let me make one thing clear so we can get past it. You are in the Brooks Mountain range of northern Alaska. There are no roads, no cars, no snow machines, nothing. I live alone, 11.5 months out of the year surviving off the land. If I'm hungry I hunt, if I'm cold I go chop wood, thirsty I boil snow or lake water. You understand? Wide-eyed, Amelia nodded, noticing for the first time the rough timbered walls around her. Okay, she sighed, what do we do? First, I think I should introduce myself. My name is Caleb Dulac, and you are, he said, extending his hand. Amelia Hamilton, she replied, awkwardly returning the shake. Okay, Amelia, Caleb said, the next thing is to figure out what we need to do to survive. I have supplies, but I don't think it will be enough to support the two of us for the next 9 months. I do have some dried moose, elk and bear meat from last year, and a few root vegetables. Of course I have the dry goods and canned stuff I picked up in town, but I haven't started hunting or trapping yet, so there's no fresh meat. I don't eat much, Amelia said, trying to be helpful. Eating a lot or not doesn't matter, Caleb explained, looking at her seriously. In the cold, you will need to eat to survive. Your body will use twice as many calories in a day out here than it would in the city just to keep you going. Oh, Amelia breathed. Well, Caleb said, coming to a decision. For now we'll survive on what I have, and maybe when you're stronger, you can help me do a little fishing. Okay, Amelia agreed, not sure if there was any real choice. Now, he said as he stood, let's see if we can find some clothes that will work for you. As Caleb moved to the other side of the cabin pulling clothing off of pegs, Amelia watched his progress. For such a large, muscular man he moved with surprising grace. When he returned, he put the pile at the foot of her bed. This one should work, he said, picking out a rough spun sweater. And these, he continued, picking out a well-worn pair of thick denim work pants. Reaching into a bin nearby, he pulled out a thermal long-sleeve shirt with several dark spots and holes on it. Your boots were thankfully undamaged, but not really meant for being out in the wilderness, he commented, handing her a collection of musty-smelling clothes. I hadn't really planned on roughing it when I dressed for the trip, Amelia explained as he placed her boots on the floor in front of her. That's the problem with people, he commented, shaking his head. They don't think about all of the possible outcomes before coming out here. I hadn't planned on my plane crashing, Amelia replied defensively. I know, Caleb said, regretting his words. I shouldn't have said that, he apologized. I guess I'm just not used to being socially correct. I usually don't have to think before I speak out here. I'm sorry. Thank you, she said, accepting the offering, but what about socks? Yours survived, Caleb said, taking a small bundle from the nearby table. I rinsed the blood out for you. Thank you again, Amanda said gratefully, accepting the roll he held out for her. Do you need any help? Caleb offered. No, she said firmly, thinking she would be able to manage. Could you just turn around?
Chapter 5.
Caleb chuckled at her embarrassment. He'd already seen her naked, more than once. He'd realized after years in isolation how silly people in the world were about their nakedness. He often ran around buck naked during the summer until the mosquitoes made it unbearable. Amelia tried in vain to dress herself, but with her shoulder pinned to her chest, and the aching of her head and body, it was impossible to even get her pants on. Making things more difficult was that every time she bent over, the room began to spin. She said, realizing how helpless she was. I think I could use a hand if you don't mind. Sure, he said, turning to face her, a smile playing at his lips. Squatting down, Caleb slipped Amelia's cold feet into her socks, admiring her pedicured toenails, then rose and unpinned the fabric that was holding the arm in place. Once it was free, and doing his best to keep his physical contact with her to a minimum, he helped her slip into the undershirt and sweater, trying not to stare too long at her breasts. Amelia moaned in pain as he slipped the fabric over her arm, then over her head. She knew he was trying to be gentle, but her shoulder screamed every time it was moved, making her gasp. Finally it was over, and Caleb repinned her arm. Thank you, she breathed, panting slightly at the exertion. Her whole body, from her toes to her scalp, ached. No problem, Caleb said. Let's get these pants on, shall we? Holding onto Caleb's shoulder for balance, Amelia stood as he threaded one leg, then the other, and pulled them up to her waist. Seeing how loosely they hung on her waist, Caleb grabbed a piece of rope and pulled it through the belt loops. There, he said, helping her sit on the edge of the bed. You sit and take a break. I'm not going to worry about shoes until you're ready to go outside. By the time she was fully dressed, Amelia was ready to curl up and go back to sleep. Caleb, she panted, do you have anything for pain? Not much, he admitted. I'll boil willow bark and make you some tea. Willow bark? Amelia asked. What will that do? It's what was used centuries before aspirin, he explained. It has salicine in it. That should help reduce the swelling. It's what main ingredient in aspirin is based on. Oh, she breathed, I didn't know that. Most people don't, he said over his shoulder as he worked at the stove. Nowadays everyone runs to the corner pharmacy and grab the nearest bottle of painkillers. I don't have that luxury. While Caleb made her tea, Amelia slowly scooted back on the bed until her back was pressed against the wall. Leaning gratefully against its solidness, she closed her eyes and let her tired mind wander. Her first thoughts were of Dale, and how he would take the news that her plane had disappeared in the Alaskan mountains. Would he even care? Amelia had known for a while that their relationship was over. She'd just been hoping that just maybe there was a chance for them to fix things instead of throwing the last 2 years away. Soon her tired mind wandered to the moment just before impact. There had been a high-pitched alarm from the control panel, and the plane started shaking. Over the sound she heard the pilot calling in sauce on the radio. Then the bone-jarring jerk as the plane slammed into the hillside. She was jolted back to wakefulness by Caleb saying her name. The sudden movement caused her to cry out in pain, tears welling in her eyes. Oh God, she sobbed, pulling her arm closer, it hurts so much. I know, Caleb soothed. I know it hurts. Drink this, then I'll help you lay back down. Nodding, Amelia took the cup and sipped the bitter liquid, coughing at the unexpected alcohol that burned its way down her throat. Sorry, Caleb smiled ruefully. I should have warned you. What is in this? Amanda asked, gasping for air. I added a little of my own secret ingredient, he replied, showing her the bottle. Whiskey. Wow, she breathed, cringing as she took another sip. Next time, just give me a heads up. Okay, he smiled as he put the bottle away on a shelf. When it was gone, Caleb helped ease her down to a prone position and pulled the blankets back up around her. Thank you, Caleb, Amelia said softly as sleep claimed her once more.
Chapter 6.
After 2 weeks of rest, Amelia was finally well enough that Caleb decided she was ready to go outside for more than just a trip to the outhouse. He'd taken such excellent care of her, feeding her broth, tender bits of meat, oatmeal, and cornmeal, that she was beginning to feel more than a little beholden to him. I was thinking about doing some fishing, he said, unpinning her arm from its brace. Fishing? Amelia asked, wincing slightly as he began their routine of moving her shoulder in circles, making sure that she didn't lose any mobility. I've looked at my food stores, and while I think they're still pretty good, he explained, pressing his palm into the muscle of her shoulder, I would like to start supplementing now, rather than waiting until we get too low. I don't usually venture out on the ice this early, but at this point any little bit of fresh protein will help. You mean I get to go outside farther than the freezing outhouse? Amelia asked, slipping her feet into her boots. Yes, you do, Caleb replied, bending down to tie the laces, a smirk playing at his lips. I don't know how much you'll be able to do. I don't want you to use your arm too much, but until we try we'll never know. Standing, he reached for his ungak. What is that? Amelia asked, eyeing the unusual tool in Caleb's hand. This, Caleb said, holding the instrument forward. This is a ungak. It's a traditional tool for checking ice thickness. This end, he explained, showing her the sharpened tip on one end. This is for poking into the ice to test how thick it is. This end, he continued, turning it around, has a hook for retrieving things. It is also useful if you do ever fall through the ice. It's long enough to hopefully catch the edges of any hole you might fall through. Wow, Amelia said, eyeing the unique object. Can you show me how to use it? I don't think you're strong enough, Caleb said, looking down at her. Where he was 6 foot of solid man, Amelia was almost a foot shorter, making him feel like a giant whenever they were side by side. Please, Amelia said, her eyes pleading up at him. I am making more work for you. The least I can do is be useful. All right, Caleb said, sighing heavily. Pulling on a heavy sweater, he handed Amelia a tattered, but still weatherproof jacket. When he'd helped her button it closed, he opened the door, scanning the clearing for danger before letting her go through. Stepping outside, and not for the first time, Amelia was enraptured to see the world Caleb had created for himself in the middle of nowhere. It was breathtakingly stunning. The cabin sat on top of a small rise overlooking an ice-covered lake with dense trees surrounding them, the entire setting backdropped by the stark whiteness of the mountains enclosing them on all sides. Walking slowly towards the water, using Caleb for help on the slippery path, she could see why someone would choose to live here. Maybe not all the time, but it looked like a beautiful place to visit. You hold the ungak like this, Caleb said, when they reached the icy edge, showing Amelia the proper grip. Then, you punch the ice with all your strength. Depending on how deep it strikes and the sound it makes, you should be able to determine if the ice is strong enough to support you. If the end goes through too easily or sounds wrong, the ice is too soft and you need to find another path. Okay, Amelia nodded her understanding. Like this? She asked, assuming the stance she'd seen Caleb take. Almost, he said, moving to stand behind her. Spread your feet a little further apart, he continued, using his own foot to adjust her position. And move your right hand a little forward, he went on, wrapping his arms around her to guide her hand to the correct position. There. Though she knew he was only trying to help, Amelia would have to be blind, deaf and dumb not to notice how solid he felt against her. He was a man's man, the smell of leather and wood smoke invading her senses. Unable to stop herself, she wondered what it would feel like for his hands to slip from the unqua and into her jacket. I get it, she replied a little breathlessly, stepping quickly out of his embrace, shocked by her own thoughts, her cheeks burning despite the chill in the air. Plunging the sharpened end of the ungak into the ice as hard as she could, Amelia only managed to skip the tip across the frosty surface at the edge of the pond and send a sharp bolt of lightning through her shoulder. I don't think you're ready for this, Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. Looking down, he saw Amelia cradling her arm, a look of pain on her face. Sorry, she said, handing the tool back with her good arm, her voice hoarse with pain. Realizing his laugh had hurt her, but not as much as the action had hurt her shoulder, Caleb took the ungak back from her. You shouldn't be out here, he said huskily, angry at himself for even thinking she would be useful to him. Go back inside. Amelia shook her head, doing her best to hide the pain she was in. You asked me to help, and I will, she said. Just tell me what you need me to do. Seeing a look of determination on her face, Caleb sighed. All right, he conceded. Stay on the shore until I check the ice. It's pretty thin towards the middle, but we should be able to get far enough out to catch something decent-sized for lunch, and if we're lucky, dinner. When I'm sure it's safe, I'll come back for you and the gear. Okay, Amelia nodded, grateful to be allowed to do something other than lay in bed. Caleb began testing the ice along the edge of the water before stepping onto it. Though winter had just started, he was sure it would still be thick enough to support them, as long as they stayed near the shore. What am I going to do with her? He thought. She was useless. Less than useless, she was a burden. He would have to feed her and keep her safe until his supply plane arrived. Shaking his head, he continued walking, absent-mindedly stabbing at the ice, not paying as much attention as he should have been. He barely registered the cracking seconds before the ice gave way beneath him. Struggling, Caleb managed to kick off his boots, but his sweater was stuck snugly to his body, its weight dragging him down. The cold water enveloped him, and panic gripped his heart as he began to sink, his clothes and own dense body mass making him sink fast. Reaching the bottom, Caleb dug his feet into the slimy mud, pushing up with all his might, clawing and kicking at the water, determined not to die this way. In his panic, he didn't see the sheet of ice, banging his head soundly against it. Trying desperately to regain his calm, Caleb began to run his hands over the underside of the ice, looking for the place he had fallen through, his legs kicking frantically to keep him from sinking again. Suddenly, he felt a hand grasp his as he was pulled to a hole in the surface. Amelia lay on her stomach stretched across the ice, desperately screaming his name.
Chapter 7.
Caleb, she cried, what do I do? I can't pull you up, I'm not strong enough. Still trying to catch his breath, Caleb looked for his ungak. Seeing it a few feet away where it had slid after he dropped it, he pointed. The ungak, he managed to gasp. Making sure Caleb's grip on the ice was secure, Amelia crawled back across the ice and grabbed for it. She pulled it with her as she made her way back towards him, her shoulder burning with the effort. By the now Caleb was in trouble, fighting desperately to remain conscious, the cold of the water working its way deep into his bones. Amelia moved as fast as she could, the ungak dragging behind her. Reaching Caleb, she maneuvered the stick around so that he could grab it. With numb hands he placed it lengthwise across the hole, making sure it was solidly braced before trying to pull himself out. WTH, the last of his strength, he heaved himself out of the water, Amelia grabbing desperately at his clothes and limbs, anything she could reach to help him out. Together, they managed to creep back across the creaking ice towards the shore. When her nails dug into frozen mud, Amelia took Caleb's arm and, helping him stand, began the arduous walk back up the hill to the cabin, slipping and sliding on the icy snow, their wet clothes chilling them to the bone. It was torturous and surreal how quickly everything had gone wrong. Once inside, she stripped Caleb down, blushing as she pulled off his undergarments, leaving him naked and shivering. His body was amazing, even chilled, his muscles tensed and well-defined under his goosebump-covered bronze skin. Grabbing a blanket from the foot of the bed, she wrapped him in it, ignoring the burning pain in her shoulder and her cheeks. With shaking hands, cold from delving into the water searching for Caleb, Amelia helped him lay down on the bed that, until that morning, she had used. Quickly, she stoked the stove, feeding it wood as quickly as her numb hands would let her. When she thought it was full enough that it would burn through the night, she filled the kettle with water, placing it on the stove to heat. Stripping off her own damp clothes, and crawled in next to Caleb, pulling open the blanket around him so their bodies could share warmth. Wrapping it and another heavy down blanket over them both, she maneuvered Caleb into her arms. Amelia wrapped her chilled body around his freezing one and held him tightly, running her hands up and down his muscular frame, trying desperately to warm his body with the friction, the only thing she could think of to do. Every muscle of his body strained under her touch as she rubbed vigorously against his skin. Unconsciously, Caleb nuzzled into her embrace, reveling in the blessed warmth Amelia was providing. His own arms snaked around Amelia's body, pulling her closer. The warmth from her body was intoxicating, he needed more. He felt himself becoming aroused against her leg, an animalistic need deep inside of him taking over. His lips trailed small kisses across her shoulder, up her neck, seeking her mouth. Amelia noticed Caleb's arousal, and quickly tried to extricate herself from his arms, but his embrace tightened. Caleb, she breathed, fighting her own arousal. Hadn't she just fantasized about this very thing? He barely heard her, too intent on her warmth, her closeness, the feel of her softness against him. He wanted more, so much more. It had been years since he'd held a woman in his arms like this, years of denying himself the simple pleasures of sex and companionship. His hands began searching, his mouth finding hers, sweet and supple. Oh, how wonderful it felt, being flesh on flesh. Amelia couldn't find the words or the will to stop him, her hands doing their own searching as his beard scratched a trail over her skin. It wasn't until Amelia cried out in pain when he crawled on top of her that they were both brought back to the present. Caleb stopped abruptly. Opening his eyes, he saw the pain on Amelia's face. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes moist with tears, her hand pushing against his chest trying to get his weight off her burning shoulder. "I'm sorry," he breathed, rolling off of her. Amelia rolled out of the bed, her arm dragging behind her. "Please, come back," he begged, the chill returning to his body. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." "I can't," she breathed, her shoulder burning in pain. "I need you," he said, his body shaking with returning cold. Seeing Caleb's quivering lips turning blue again, Amelia hastily grabbed a dry shirt off a peg. She struggled into it before slipping back under the blanket with him, using a quilt as a barrier between them. Gingerly he wrapped his arms around her body once more, making sure he wasn't putting unnecessary pressure on her. Caleb molded himself against her. She could still feel his manhood, as erect as ever, pressing against her hip, but tried to ignore it. Caleb was right, he needed her body heat. If he died from this, she wouldn't survive. Amelia knew without a doubt that she didn't have the skills required to live in the Alaskan bush without him. This accident had made that more than evident. If an experienced outdoors man like Caleb could get hurt, she was doomed if he died. Finally his trembling subsided and he drifted off into a deep sleep, still clinging tightly to her.
Chapter 8.
Amelia imagined it was Dale holding her, trying to slow her pounding heart. It was his arms wrapped around her. It was his breath that she could feel fanning her hair. Her relationship with Dale had begun with admiration and companionship after her father's death. She had been so distraught, returning from college to find he'd been sick for months and hadn't told her. In less than a week after her graduation, he'd died, leaving her alone in the world. It had been Dale, her father's lawyer, who'd saved her from her grief. He'd explained how her father had wanted her to finish school and not shackle herself to a sick and dying man. Amelia had inherited the gas drilling company her father started, and soon she and Dale were spending more and more time together trying to make sure that the board didn't take over and cut her out of decisions. Working so closely, she soon realized she was in love with him. Dale had tried his best to convince Amelia that he was too old for her, being 10 years her senior, that she would be happier married to a younger man, but she'd loved him too much to listen to such nonsense. He was the one she wanted, and after a year, he'd asked her to marry him, though they had yet to set a date even after 2 years. Dale had done his best to make her happy, trying to ensure that she wanted for nothing, but in this he fell a little short. He worked too hard and too long for her liking, often missing dinners and holiday celebrations. After the first 6 months she'd begun to wonder if she'd made a mistake with the engagement, but she'd still loved him too much to throw the idea of a life together away. Thinking of Dale made her heart ache with pain. The shock he would feel when he heard about the crash would be terrible, and his doctor had spoken to him several times about easing back his stress load and enjoying life. Her disappearance would do nothing to help him. Amelia felt tears in her eyes as she thought about how he would take the news, envisioning him pacing his office, hair mussed, tie hanging loosely around his neck. She wouldn't be there to soothe him, to assure him that everything would be okay. Caleb stirred in her arms, pulling her closer to him and bringing her mind back to the present. Who was this man, this stranger? Why did he lie alone in the wilderness? Was he running from something? Was he a criminal? Amelia shook her head at that last question. If he were a danger, he wouldn't have bothered to save her. He could have left her to freeze to death. Instead he had brought her to a place that was warm and secure from the animals. If he had intended to harm her, he'd had plenty of opportunity before now, and he seemed genuinely ashamed of his erection. The one thing she did know for sure, he was horny. How long had it been since he'd been with someone? Caleb slowly awoke, his head resting against Amelia's. Carefully, he lifted himself and looked down at her. She was looking back, the pain still written across her face. "How are you feeling?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "My shoulder," she said, trying to keep the agony she was feeling out of her voice. "I'll repin it for you," he offered, taking his arm off of her. "Let's get up, okay?" "Okay," she said, struggling to move. With a gentle push from Caleb she was able to get to her feet. "Thank you," she sighed, sinking into a chair. Raising her hand to the stove, she didn't feel any heat radiating from it. "Damn," she cursed, angry at herself for failing to keep the fire going. "I should have put more wood in." "Don't worry about it," Caleb soothed, moving towards her with her arm wrappings. "I'll take care of it." "Oh, oh, oh," Amelia cried as he folded her arm to her chest and pinned it tightly in place. "I'm sorry," Caleb breathed, the knowledge that this time her injuries were his fault. I should have known better than to go out onto the ice so early. When Amelia's arm was finally secure, he moved to the stove and after thoroughly sweeping out the ashes laid a new fire. As its warmth began to fill the small cabin, Caleb brewed more willow bark tea and mixed up a batch of flat bread. Placing a steaming cup in front of Amelia, Caleb sat across from her with his own, placing the plate of bread between them. I am so sorry about yesterday, he said, watching her taking small sips. I should have been more careful. Fuck, he exclaimed, slamming his hand down. I should never have gone out there. It's okay, Amelia replied softly, slightly frightened but the gesture. You're alive. I'm alive. It could have been a lot worse than hurting my shoulder again. Seeing the sense in her words, Caleb settled into silence, pulling a slice of bread to pieces, not even bothering to eat any of it. As the tea seeped into her system, easing the aches in her body, Amelia looked around, seeing the clothes they'd abandoned the night before on the floor. Lifting a shirt, she found that the parts of the fabric that hadn't been exposed to the oven were still wet. These are still damp, Amelia said, holding the shirt up to the heat of the stove. I have some rope out in the shed that should serve as a nice clothesline, Caleb said, glad for something to do besides sulk. I can do it, she replied, wanting to be useful. If you string it up, I'll hang the clothes. Not with your shoulder, he responded, strapping on his revolver. My shoulder's not too bad, she said, turning her left side away from him. No, Caleb said, startling her as he stepped to stand in front of her. We both know you heard it, he continued, shrugging on a sweater. Pulling me across the ice, up the hill and getting us both undressed and wrapped in blankets didn't do you any favors. I want you to keep your arm immobilized for at least another week. Is there anything I can do? Amelia asked, knowing he was right. Yeah, he said, moving to the door, drink your tea and have some bread. Knowing there was no use arguing, her shoulder hurt just sitting still, she took a piece of flat bread from the plate and nibbled at it. The texture was both dry and chewy at the same time, her mind trying to decide which was worse. Dipping it into her tea helped, a little, and by the time Caleb returned with the rope she'd managed to eat too. Should we wash them first? She asked, indicating the clothes as he scooped them off the floor. No, Caleb replied, draping each piece across the cord. If our clothes are too clean, the animals will move away from the area, and my trapping will go to shit. Every time she tried to help, Caleb told her to sit still. If you don't sit still, he finally said, exasperated, I'm gonna take some of this rope and tie you to the chair. Amelia opened her mouth to reply hotly, but she could see by the look on Caleb's face that he'd meant it. Sorry, he apologized, kneeling in front of her. I just don't want you to hurt yourself any worse. Life out here is tough enough with two good arms, he continued, looking up at her through his shaggy mane of hair. I need you to listen to me and do what I say. I did that yesterday, Amelia replied hotly, angered at being treated like a child. Caleb fell back on his heels, his mouth dropping open.
Chapter 9.
Unable to think of a response that wasn't hurtful, Caleb simply grabbed his gun and left the cabin. Amelia regretted the words the second they were out of her mouth, but it was too late, he was gone. Fighting back tears, she looked around for something to do, something useful. Her eyes fell on the empty kettle sitting on the table. She remembered seeing the dented thing filled with steaming water every time she woke up. Now it sat idle. Taking it, she went to the bucket Caleb filled with snow multiple times a day. She filled the kettle one scoop at a time. Lifting the ladle for the 10th time, she had to admit that only having one arm was limiting and arduous. Putting it on the stove, it gave off little hisses as the little droplets of water hanging from the bottom evaporated against the hot metal. Amelia was startled by a loud ringing gunshot from outside, causing her to stumble into the stove in fear, burning her hand. Caleb, she cried, dropping the utensil. The silence seemed to stretch out forever before Caleb walked back in, finding Amelia standing with her back to the wall, shaking with fear, cradling her burned hand to her chest. Dropping his rifle, he quickly moved to her side. Amelia, he said, gently taking her by the shoulders, what happened? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. I was so scared, she breathed. I thought something had attacked you. No, he said, gently touching her cheek. There was a wolf prowling around the meat shed. I just fired a round to scare it off. Amelia sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. Caleb slowly wrapped his own arms around her, holding on to her tightly and trying to soothe her while she cried. I'm sorry, she sniffled as she lifted her head from the crook of his neck. It's just after last night, I realized that if anything happened to you I would die. When I heard the shot, then silence, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if it was safe to go outside to find you, she continued hiccuping. I'm okay, he assured her, cupping her face with his hand. The feel of his rough, warm hands on her face made her think of the previous night, of his lips seeking out hers, his hands groping at her. Feeling himself becoming aroused at her closeness, Caleb reached up and pulled at her hands, trying to disengage her body from his. Touching the burn, Amelia winced in pain and snatched her hand away, holding it to her chest. Let me take a look, Caleb said, reaching for her. Amelia showed him the bright red mark that looked like it might be starting to blister. Come on, he said, leading her to the door. Stepping outside, he scooped up a handful of ice and held it to the burn. You are seriously accident-prone, he said, shaking his head. Amelia remained silent as he added more ice to the wound. I'm sorry, he said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence, for yelling at you earlier. I shouldn't have done that. I guess you can say I'm lacking in social graces and patience, he explained. No, she sighed, knowing he'd been right. I am accident-prone, and I'm also hard-headed. I know you are just trying to make the best of things, and I will do my best to listen and do what you say. Okay, he agreed, nodding as he pulled the snow away. The burn looked like it would be painful, but it shouldn't blister. Let's get inside, he said, turning his head to the sky. It's going to snow. How can you tell? Amelia asked, looking in the same direction, but seeing nothing that would indicate it. Trust me, he encouraged, I've been here a long time. Before closing them in, Caleb made sure that there was enough firewood inside to keep them warm for a few days. While he didn't think it would be that bad, he knew the wilderness was no place to take a risk. Once everything was ready, he then sat at the small table running through some numbers in his head. Not wanting to try fishing again, he could think of only one other way to supplement their diet before he would be able to go hunting for anything edible. He'd have to hike up to the plain once the storm passed. Every bush plane that flies out here was required to carry an emergency pack. There should be dried food, medical supplies and other things they could use until his own pilot arrived. Unlike the lake, getting up the mountain should be relatively easy as long as it didn't snow too much. Hopefully the trail he'd broken to his satellite camp would still be good. From there he could find her track up the mountain to wreckage. The only problem he really saw was the young woman sitting across from him. He was pretty sure she wouldn't want him to go, but without the assurance of those extra supplies, Caleb knew he'd be more and more worried as the winter progressed. If the storm was mild and didn't last too long, he could leave in a day or two and be there and back within a day.
Chapter 10.
Good morning, Caleb said as Amelia got out of bed the next morning. Morning, she replied, wiping the sleep from her eyes with one hand. You're up early. In truth, Caleb hadn't slept much the night before. Every time he closed his eyes he was back under the ice, his fist beating uselessly against its indifferent surface. There was no one there to pull him free, to warm him up. He was alone. He'd sat up waiting for morning, for Amelia to wake, planning his next move. He knew what he had to do. I meant to tell you yesterday what quick thinking you had, he said, pulling on his extra pair of boots. Stripping us out of our wet clothes and sharing body warmth like that. I read a magazine article on the plane up to Anchorage, Amelia explained, fingering knots out of her hair, about what to do if you got wet out here. I'm glad you did, Caleb said, standing and looking down at her. You saved my life. No problem, Amelia said, feeling a little odd with Caleb hovering over her. This early in October he could get some rabbits, or maybe even a bear, but that would mean leaving Amelia alone for several days to run a trap line, or track an animal, while traveling to the plain would only take the day. With a sigh, he reached for his traveling pack. Where are you going? Amelia asked, seeing Caleb packing a bag. Well, he said, inspecting his rifle, tomorrow I plan on heading up to the crash site and see if I can find anything useful. What? She asked, falling onto a stool. I think, he said with a sigh, there are still about 2 weeks until I can legally start hunting more than rabbits. The plane should have a full stash of emergency supplies. Pale and shaking slightly, Amelia closed her eyes. Okay, she said, remembering her promise to listen to him. When do we leave? We aren't leaving, Caleb replied, stressing the word. I'm leaving after I teach you how to shoot and I make sure you're set for a day or two alone. Caleb, Amelia pleaded, I know I'm not a mountain woman, but... Amelia, Caleb soothed, standing and moving to squat next to her. I need to be able to travel fast and light. I need you, he continued, lifting her face to look at him, to stay safe, warm, and snug. Okay, she assented softly, hating the tears that escaped her eyes. And part of staying safe, Caleb said, standing and reaching up on a shelf above her head, is making sure you know how to use this. In his hand, he held a large revolver. This is a .45 caliber revolver, he began. I hate guns, Amelia told him. I thought you said you were from Texas, he laughed. I may be from Texas, Amelia replied, looking at him coolly. That doesn't mean I know anything about guns. Okay, Caleb replied, nodding, taking a quick look out the window. It looks like the snow has stopped. Let's go outside and I'll give you a quick tutorial. Lining up several small rocks on a plank, Caleb showed her how to breathe out as she pulled the trigger, how to line up the sights for accuracy. After chastising her for closing her eyes every time she pulled the trigger, she was soon hitting the rocks more often than she missed. Good, he congratulated her. I don't want to use too much more ammunition on practice. You shoot well enough. Thanks, Amelia replied, grateful that she was good at something out here. Let's go inside, Caleb said, motioning back to the house. I'll show you how to make some cornmeal mush and broth out of some of the dried meat I have. The rest of the day Caleb spent teaching Amelia as much as he could to make sure she'd be able to take care of herself if the trip took more than a day. He even showed her how to make fried corn cakes out of the mush. Silently they ate their less than flavorful mush and drank tea, each lost in their own thoughts. Caleb going over and over what he needed to take with him and what he hoped to find. Amelia trying desperately to keep from begging him not to go. After eating, Caleb brought in extra buckets for water from his shed and filled them with snow until they'd melted to the brim. He then chopped more wood and made sure there was more than enough inside to keep the stove going for several days. He also brought in several bundles of dried meat, some bear, some moose. Well, Caleb said, indicating all of his efforts, it looks like you're set. I'm gonna bed down on the floor again so I can get an early start tomorrow. Keep the door barred until I get back. There should be more than enough water and I've made sure there's enough wood if I take more than a day. More than a day? Amelia asked, her head snapping up to look at him. I don't plan to be gone that long, he explained, standing to put his bowl in the wash basin, but up here you plan for all contingencies. Caleb left her sitting at the table, fear settling on her chest like a lead weight. Caleb, Amelia said, catching his hand as he passed her. Why don't you take the bed tonight? I'll sleep on the floor. That way you can have a good rest before heading out tomorrow. It's okay, he assured her. I've slept in rougher places than on a wooden floor next to a warm stove. Don't worry about it. Are you sure? She asked. Yeah, he said, turning down the lantern. Let's get some rest. With that, Caleb laid down on the folded quilt he'd been using as a bed since Amelia arrived and he'd given her his. Good night, Amelia said, clambering over him on the bed. Good night, he replied, extinguishing the lamp completely.
Chapter 11.
In the morning, Amelia woke up at the same time Caleb did and insisted that he eat an extra large helping of corn mush and softened jerky before she would let him leave. All right, he finally had to say, pushing his plate away, I'm not going to be able to move if I eat any more. Take some with you, Amelia insisted. Amelia, he said softly, taking her gently by the shoulders, remembering her injury. I will be fine, but if I don't leave soon, I'm going to miss what little sun there's going to be today. Okay, Amelia replied, knowing he was right. Caleb pulled on his spare, heavily patched jacket and fur gloves. Shrugging on his pack, he reached for his rifle ready to leave. Caleb, Amelia said, placing her hand on his arm, I know this is your world, and you're used to the dangers of it, but please, for the love of God, be careful. I will, Caleb nodded, offering her an assuring smile. Keep a light on for me. With that he shouldered his rifle and walked out into the wilderness. Amelia watched as Caleb's form disappeared into the tree line. When she could no longer follow his progress, she turned away from the window and looked around the cabin. With a slight shock, she realized that since regaining consciousness she'd never really looked around it at all. It was a decent cabin, small and cozy and well-built, but definitely a man's cabin. There was a small cast iron stove in one corner, its pipe running up and curving so it followed the roof line around two of the walls, then out a hole in the roof. It took Amelia a moment to puzzle out the reason for this, the engineer and her finally realizing that it spread heat around the most used corner of the cabin. Next to the stove was the basin for washing, tools and dishes from what she'd seen Caleb do, and above it were shelves stacked with an assortment of plates, cups, bowls, even pots and pans. They all looked well used and some of them were in desperate need of replacement. She also found dust-covered stacks of canned vegetables, canisters of dried, unlabeled herbs, coffee and tea, rice and beans, everything a man on his own in the wilderness would need. Amelia ran her finger over the table next to the basin, feeling its surface. It looked as though Caleb had made it by hand, smoothed from constant use. The top of it was littered with odd-looking tools she had no idea what he did with, and seeing the rust and darker staining on them, she was pretty sure she didn't want to know. Unable to relax, she decided to tackle the flotsam and jetsam that covered the table. The neat freak in her screaming at tools left to rust. Knowing Caleb's supplies were limited, she looked around for simple things she could use to do the job. Digging through the collection of unlabeled boxes and bins under the table, she found exactly what she was looking for. Pulling out 2 small bowls, she filled one with a small bit of vinegar and the other with what she hoped was baking soda. She then took a rag she found and began to scrub and buff the rust off each tool one by one. It wasn't a perfect job, but she didn't want to use more of Caleb's supplies than she had to. Amelia was able to get enough gunk and grime off that she felt like she had accomplished something. When they had all been scrubbed, she looked around and decided she would just clean the entire cabin, from top to bottom. Hadn't Caleb saved her life? Wasn't he at this moment risking his own to try and find extra supplies? She'd clean the grime from years of manly neglect and make as hearty of a dinner for Caleb as she could. Nodding to herself, she rolled up her sleeves and set to work. First, she pulled everything off of the shelves and washed them down with a damp soapy cloth. With the heat from the stove they dried quickly, making the air smell sweet and pungent of wet wood and lye soap. Amelia restocked the cans and bins, doing her best to identify and mark the freshly dusted containers. In the end she had 8 cans that could have been anything from string beans to peaches, but for the most part she was pleased by her progress. Finding a tin can with a thick oily substance that looked like Crisco, Amelia turned back to the tools. A thin coat of whatever it was would help keep them from rusting too quickly. Making sure they were completely dry, she rubbed small dabs into each happily content in the job. It had been so long since she'd taken time to do simple things like cleaning and organizing a kitchen. Shaking her head at her own silliness, she finished polishing the last knife and laid it neatly next to the others. She saved the table for last, since that is where she was placing everything from the floor and shelves there while she cleaned. Picking up the palette Caleb had been using, she shook the pieces vigorously, cringing at the sound of dust and debris that fell from them. Thinking she'd love to wash them, but remembering Caleb's warning about things smelling too clean, she settled for another vigorous shake before folding the fabric and placing them on the bed. As she finished, she looked at the small pile of dirt and dust on the floor and sighed contentedly at a job well done. Scooping the debris into the empty bowl she'd used to hold the powder for cleaning the tools, she felt almost like her old self. Opening the door to toss out the filth, she saw for the first time that it had begun to snow, the flakes falling so thickly that she could barely make out the tree line 20 feet away. Trying to keep the fear from overwhelming her, she went back inside. Racking her brain for anything that she could do that would be helpful, she remembered a night during her junior year at college when a tornado had torn through town, causing a blackout in her dorm. Her roommate at the time had taped a flashlight to the side of an old milk jug and filled it with water. The effect produced almost 3 times as much light than just the flashlight alone. Saying a heartfelt thank you to that long-lost friend, she blessed her lucky stars that she had just gone through almost the entire cabin and knew exactly where to find what she needed. Amelia grabbed an old plastic jug Caleb used to store melted snow, strapped a headlamp to it with the light inverted. Clicking it on, the entire jug glowed to life, filling the cabin and her heart with light. Taking the light jug outside, Amelia trudged around the cabin, finding a stump just tall enough for her to reach the roof if she stood on her tiptoes. Gingerly, she balanced the jug on the roof of the cabin. Hopping down, she stood back and hoped it would be enough light to guide Caleb home. With one last glance toward the direction Caleb had gone, she returned to the warmth of the cabin. Moving around the end of the bed, Amelia stubbed the toe of her boot on a trunk that had been hidden under a pile of furs. Curious, she moved the pile aside. Looking down at it, she saw that it was an old, delicately painted steamer trunk, something one might find in their grandmother's attic, not in a log cabin in the middle of nowhere. Bending down, she lifted the lid. Inside were neat stacks of pictures and cards tied with twine. As she lifted a stack of photos, one fell out. Retrieving it, she saw a striking young woman holding a toddler staring back at her. Looking at the child's face, Amelia thought she saw a likeness to Caleb. Maybe it was a picture of him as a baby. As her gaze passed over the photo once more, a glint of metal buried deeper in the trunk caught her eye. Putting the stack of pictures down, Amelia reached in and pulled out a metal badge, an Alaskan State Trooper's badge. On it was written Officer Dulac with a black ribbon wrapped around it. Caleb was a cop, she thought. She reached down and picked up the pictures again. Untying the twine, she leafed through them, seeing a smiling Caleb looking at the infant with unabashed love. In others, his arms were wrapped around the woman from the first photo. In all of the images, the couple looked so happy and content. Why was Caleb living out here when it looked like he had a family somewhere else? Taking the next stack of papers out of the trunk, Amelia found several letters of commendation for Caleb. It seemed that he had been an excellent cop. Why had he quit? The last stack of papers at the bottom of the trunk cleared up a little of the mystery she'd uncovered. It was a divorce decree for one Caleb Dulac and one Elizabeth Shaw Dulac. The reason given was irreconcilable differences, with sole custody of their daughter, Lucy, given to her mother.
Chapter 12.
Caleb stopped and wiped the slushy snow off his goggles. He'd made it to the crash site in good time despite the incline of the hill and its thick covering of snow. Seeing the size of the debris field and the violence with which the plane impacted, he was amazed that Amelia had managed to survive it all. Her seat, which looked to have sheared free when the craft struck the tree line, was a good 100 yards away from the main body of the crash. Searching the wreckage, Caleb found the pilot. "Damn," he said under his breath, recognizing him. "Billy." After digging a shallow grave due to the frozen state of the ground, he collected Bill's wedding ring and wallet, knowing his widow would want them. With a short prayer, he placed the pilot in the ground, covering the spot with large pieces of the plane to keep animals from digging him up. When that was completed, he strapped everything he thought could be useful, and a few things that weren't, to his sled and began the walk back down the mountain. Halfway down, he'd seen the clouds rolling in towards the valley below. Pulling out his compass, he found his bearings and trudged on, redoubling his efforts to make it back before the storm hit. Cresting a low hill, his eye was caught by a bright spot to his left. Squinting, he could barely make out the roof of his cabin through the blowing snow. "Clever girl," he thought as he adjusted his heading and walked the last 100 yards home. Amelia was so engrossed in the photographs and papers she'd found, she didn't hear the door open behind her. "What are you doing?" Caleb boomed, standing in the darkened opening. Amelia stood quickly, scattering the pictures and letters that had been sitting on her lap. "You made it," she cried, embarrassed at being caught snooping, but also delighted he'd returned safely. Dropping his rucksack at the door, Caleb shouldered past her and began scooping up the papers. "What gives you the right to go through my things?" he demanded. Amelia got down on the floor with him, trying to help collect the mess she's made. "Don't touch them," he said fiercely, pushing her hands away. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she said, touching his shoulder. "You had no right," he said, choking back a sob as he looked down at a picture of the infant. "Please," she begged, "let me help." Nodding curtly, Caleb allowed her to help him stack and retie to bundles. When everything was restored to their original places and the lid closed, Caleb leaned against the trunk, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Amelia stood and dragged the bags Caleb had left on the porch, closing the door behind her. She then returned to kneel in front of him, clasping his shaking hands in her own. "Caleb, I am so sorry," she said sincerely. "I didn't mean to pry." "You had no right," he sighed, the sobbing subsiding. "If I could take it back I would," she said, earnestness radiating from her being. "I know," Caleb said, finally looking at her with red-rimmed eyes. Trying to change the subject, Amelia gestured to the bags. "I see you found the crash," she said. "How bad was it?" "Pretty bad," he sighed, taking a seat at his now clean table. "You were really lucky you made it out alive at all. Was there anything useful?" she asked, not wanting to relive the crash, but trying to take the focus off of her prying. Knowing what Amelia was attempting to do, and inwardly thanking her for it, Caleb pulled the largest, most battered bag over and unzipping the top. The plane's beacon was fried in the crash, so no help there. "I did find the survival kit," he said, pulling things out. "There's 2 weeks of MREs, which are awesome to have, not so awesome to eat. I think we should save these until we are desperate." "I've never had them, so I'll take your word for it," Amelia said with a small laugh. There was also a nice emergency medical kit, some fishing tackle, a really nice knife, he said, unsheathing it and showing Amelia the gleaming edge. Lots of matches, some signal strobes and smoke markers, 2 very useful mosquito head nets. The hatchet and snowshoes were bent to hell and splintered, so I left them behind. There were also a couple of sub-zero sleeping bags and some heavy wool blankets. "Wow," Amelia said, staring at the growing pile of treasure. "Not done yet," Caleb smiled, reaching back into the bag. I also found a hacksaw and 3 extra blades, a pack with about 30 feet of snare wire, an ice chisel, a collapsible snow shovel, 3 flashlights and extra batteries, and last but not least, I found the pilot's stash of liquor. Liquor? Amelia asked, her eyes widening. Are you telling me the pilot was drunk? No, ma'am, Caleb said. Billy was a better man than that. Billy, she mused. Yes, that was his name. Yeah, he nodded. Billy was an excellent bush pilot, but he was a terrible businessman. He was never good with money, so he came up with a way to make lots. He'd buy bourbon, gin, whiskey and the like down in Anchorage or Juneau, and whenever he took a passenger to the oil fields he'd pack as much of it as he thought he could into the hold and sell it to the riggers. Aren't there stores up in the fields for the workers to buy from? Amelia asked, sitting down on the side of the bed. Not so much, Caleb replied, looking across the room at her. You see, most of the companies have bars where their workers can drink, but they keep tight leashes on those guys, you know, making sure everyone shows up to work sober. So Billy got the idea of buying it cheap and selling it high. And he was going to do this on my trip. Amelia asked, dumbfounded. Seems like it, Caleb said, nodding. From the looks of it he overloaded the hold and bang, down you went. So, she asked, trying desperately to clarify. We crashed because Billy was trying to make a quick buck. Looks that way, he said, rubbing his hands on his knees as he stood. I'm gonna be sick, Amelia breathed, hugging herself. Hey, Caleb soothed, sitting next to and embracing her. You made it out, alive. And in about 6 months, the plane that brings my supplies will arrive and take you home. At the thought of getting on board another plane, Amelia's composure broke and she began crying uncontrollably, turning into Caleb's strong embrace. It's all right, he cooed, pulling her close. You will be all right. After several minutes, she was able to regain control of herself and began taking deep, shuddering breaths. I'm not usually so emotional, she hiccuped. Are you kidding? Caleb chuckled, looking down at her in surprise. I honestly expected you to break down long before now. You did? She asked, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Yeah, he replied, laughing at the smear of snot she'd left on her face. What? She asked, unaware of how she looked. Nothing, he said, still laughing. You just reminded me of a glazed donut, that's all. Wha? She asked, touching her face. Oh God, she said in disgust, her hand coming away covered with snot. Rising, Amelia went to the basin, grabbing a rag, wiping her face. Well, she sighed, that was embarrassing. Don't worry about it, Caleb chuckled. Who am I gonna tell? With another sigh, Amelia turned and pointed to the bags they had yet to open. How about those? She asked. What's in them? That one is just the slip covers for the plane, Caleb explained, indicating the bag on the left. Not necessarily useful right away, but they're rated to protect a plane from Arctic storms when it's grounded, so I thought they were better to have than not. Good idea, Amelia said, agreeing wholeheartedly. And the last bag, Caleb said, lifting it and handing it to her, is yours. The contents were scattered all over the place. I picked up as much as I could find. Thank you, Amelia said, pulling it open. Inside were her thick wool socks, long johns, a pair of jeans and 3 sweaters. She also found underwear and a mismatched set of flannel pajamas. Digging deeper, she found her heavy winter gloves and rabbit fur earmuffs. At the very bottom was her spare set of snow pants and thermal underclothes. This is wonderful, she sighed, feeling as if Caleb had brought her a pirate's treasure trove when she found her toiletries bag. I can finally brush my teeth. Clearing his throat, Caleb pulled a small pouch out of his jacket pocket. I also collected Billy's wedding ring and wallet before I buried him, to give to his family when you get back to civilization, he explained, sliding it across the table to her. Taking it reverently, Amelia held it to her heart for a moment, then placed it in her bag of clothes. Thank you, she said. I'm sure his wife will be very grateful to have these. Good, Caleb said, getting to his feet. Now we just need to figure out where to store all this stuff. I found a couple of extra bins when I was cleaning earlier, Amelia said, pointing at the spot where she had stacked them. Looking around, Caleb finally noticed how different his cabin looked. You cleaned? He asked. Yeah, Amelia admitted. I couldn't sit still while you were out there alone, so I cleaned up a bit. Your shoulder, he replied, gently touching her arm. I was careful not to use it too much, she explained, his touch making her feel odd. Caleb moved to the table and looked at his skinning knives. How did you get these so shiny? He asked. I used some vinegar, baking soda and a lot of elbow grease. I scrubbed as much of the rust off as I could, Amelia said, sitting back down to look through her pile of loot. After they dried I rubbed them with a little bit of oil I found in that blue tin up there. Caleb stiffened. That blue tin? Caleb asked, pointing to the one on the shelf. Yeah, Amelia said from the floor where she was trying to organize her clothes. Damn it. Caleb breathed, doing his best to control his anger. She'd gone through his things, rearranged his house, and worst of all, she'd used the bear grease he kept for cooking. Did I do something wrong? Amelia asked, hearing the anger in his voice. No, he lied. It's just that this oil, he continued, taking the tin off the shelf, is very hard to come by. I'm sorry, Amelia said, standing up quickly. I just used the smallest of dabs, honest. Caleb took a deep breath and turned to look at her. You can't waste stuff like this, okay? He said with a tired voice. I didn't know about the oil, I'm sorry, she said, for what seemed to be the 100th time. And I honestly didn't mean to pry into the trunk either, I was just trying to do something useful. I know, Caleb said, placing his hands on her shoulders. And thank you. Now, let's get this stuff put away and make something to eat.
Chapter 13.
Sitting at the table, Amelia watched as Caleb toyed with the soup she'd made. That smells wonderful, he said, his stomach rumbling. I hope it tastes good too, she replied, scooping up a spoonful herself. Caleb took a bite, rolling the tenderized meat around in his mouth, enjoying the spiciness of the herbs and black pepper. It's good, he burbled, soup dripping down his chin. It's really, really good, he repeated, spooning more into his mouth. I found some dried sage on the shelf, Amelia explained, pointing to the clean shelf. Granted, they were really old, but I think they still added a nice flavor to it. Sage? Caleb asked, looking to the indicated shelf. I'd forgotten I even had any. I found a lot of mystery containers up there, she continued. I was able to identify most of them, though there are about 4 or 5 I couldn't place. Which ones? He asked, suddenly interested in supplies long forgotten. Amelia stood and reached up, wincing a bit when she tried to use her left arm. Trying to cover her pain, she quickly switched to her right and took down the unknown herbs. Are you okay? Caleb asked, having seen the pain on her face. I'm fine, Amelia lied, putting on an unconvincing smile. Accepting her assurances, he picked up the first container. Opening it, Caleb took a careful sniff. Not getting anything, he breathed deeper, inhaling some of the herbs into his nose. Caleb began sneezing uncontrollably, dropping the container, spilling its contents all over the table. Amelia burst into laughter as he tried desperately to stop, his eyes watering and the muscles of his back aching with each bellowing sneeze. He sneezed, I'm sorry. About the mess. It's fine, Amelia said, wiping tears of laughter from her cheeks as she swept the spilled herbs off the table, into her hand. I think, he began, sneezing again, I think that one was once fennel. Well, Amelia chuckled, it doesn't matter anymore. Whatever it was went up your nose or across the table. With a final rib-cracking sneeze, Caleb collapsed back against his seat. Still giggling, Amelia handed him a rag to wipe his nose. Maybe we should wait on the rest, she suggested, indicating the other containers. I think that would be a good idea, Caleb sniffed, blowing his nose. That was unpleasant. Would you like some more soup? Amelia asked, holding her hand out for his bowl. No, he said with a cough, I think I'm done. I'll do the dishes, she said, taking the steaming kettle off the stove and pouring it into the wash basin. As she cleaned, Caleb organized the supplies he'd salvaged from the plane. With the empty boxes Amelia had found, he had plenty of places to store everything. When everything was cleaned and put away, Caleb sat back down and produced a cognac bottle and 2 empty cups. I thought we could celebrate our new relative wealth, he explained, filling their cups. I took a few of the unbroken bottles from the plane's hold. Here, he said, handing her a cup, to finding treasures. I thought you only used this stuff for medicinal purposes, Amelia said, sipping at it gingerly, and was instantly coughing. Oh my God, she rasped. That's not a drink, it's an astringent. Caleb laughed, taking a small sip from his. Yeah, he sighed, letting the liquid burn its way down his throat, it's good for that too. I usually don't imbibe, but after burying Billy and seeing the hell you survived, I think we've earned a little something. Amelia simply nodded her head and clinked her cup against his. Speaking of which, he continued, putting down his drink. It's time for those stitches on your forehead to come out. Absently, Amelia reached up and touched her forgotten wound. Caleb stood and returned with the medical kit he'd found. Opening it, he pulled out an alcohol wipe, tiny scissors and a large adhesive bandage. Are you ready? He asked, searching her eyes. Taking a deep drink from her cup, she inhaled deeply before nodding. Caleb worked quickly, cleaning the scissors before snipping the stitches he'd made. Thankfully, only one required any effort to remove, blood trickling from the holes it left behind. Sighing, thankful that the hard part was over, he wiped the area clean with the alcohol pad, apologizing to Amelia when she cringed in pain. Applying the bandage, he allowed his shoulders to finally relax. All done, he breathed, truly happy. Taking the stitches out had gone better than he could have hoped for. Thank you, Amelia said, running a shaking hand over the rough fabric of the bandage. I don't know about you, Caleb said, gripping his cup, but after that I could use another drink. Amen, she replied, finishing off her own cup.
Chapter 14.
Slightly tipsy, having never been a big drinker, she put down her empty mug. For a long time the two of them sat in the soft lantern light, sipping from their cups until Amelia finally broke the silence. I have an idea I'd like to pose to you, she said, the amber liquor running warm and thick through her body. Shoot, Caleb sighed, leaning back in his chair. Well, Amelia continued, topping off their drinks, we really don't know much about each other. He agreed with a nod. I thought we could each ask a question, which the other answers and take turns, she explained. It could help us understand each other a little better, since we are going to be stuck together for a while. I'll go first, Caleb said quickly. How long have you been engaged? 2 years, Amelia replied, sipping from her cup. Why so long? Caleb asked, drinking from his own cup. Hey, Amelia chastised, it's my turn. You're right, Caleb said, nodding. You go. How long were you married? She asked. Caleb took a deep drink before answering. 3 years, he said, staring blankly into his cup. Dale and I just never got around to setting a date, Amelia said offhandedly. Caleb asked, looking up at her. You asked why Dale and I have been engaged so long, Amelia explained, drinking more. We've just never set a date. Okay, Caleb said. Your turn again. What happened? Amelia asked. With your marriage. I mean, I saw the divorce papers, but why did you split up? Since you've looked in my trunk, you know I was a state trooper, Caleb sighed, staring at the floor. My partner was killed about 7 years ago, and I took it really hard. I mean, he took a bullet that was meant for me. Anyway, I went through a really bad patch, he continued, and after a while Lizzie, my ex-wife, said she'd had enough. She told me to get help or she was going to leave. I wasn't in a place to realize that I needed help. I thought it was everyone else who had a problem. When I did nothing, she divorced me and took our daughter to Wisconsin to be with her family. I'm so sorry, Amelia said, reaching out her hand and covering his. After she was gone I realized she'd been right. I did need help, but I didn't want to be around people anymore. So I packed up and bought the hunting rights for 20 miles of this mountain range, Caleb explained, waving his hand around his head, indicating the cabin. This became my therapy, the hard work, the tough lifestyle. Since moving out here I've done really well. Without a word, Caleb placed his free hand on top of hers and began to gently stroke the top with his thumb. So, Amelia said, her eyes riveted on him, you just packed up and moved to the middle of nowhere. How did you survive? I grew up in Alaska, Caleb explained, withdrawing the hand Amelia had been holding, but leaving his other on top of hers and refilled both their cups. My family lived off the land, only supplementing our pantry with fruits and vegetables from the local grocery store for special occasions. I took down my first caribou when I was 8, so it wasn't hard to make the decision. The first year was the roughest, I think, he added, living out of a tent while I cut the lumber for this place and built the furniture. Having no one to talk to, knowing every night I went to sleep I could wake up with a bear or wolf chewing on me. Wow, Amelia breathed, enthralled by his tale. Okay, Caleb said, adding more liquor to their almost empty cups. My turn. You owe me 2 questions. First, where did you grow up? Amelia smiled. I grew up in Houston, she said, leaning back in her seat. My dad owned an oil company. My mom died when I was just a little girl. Cancer. Well, I went to a private prep school. And after graduation I went to A&M, she said, wondering why her cup was empty. I got my master's in environmental science. The plan was to work at our company making sure our drilling impact in any area was minimal, she continued, sadness marring her face. But when I got back to Houston, I found out my dad was really sick. He'd been hiding it from me for a long time. Dale was his lawyer, so we ended up spending a lot of time together, dealing with business and the like, she said, a wistful look on her face. After a while, we realized that our relationship had changed from business to being in love. So, Caleb said, slightly confused and more than a little tipsy, if Dale was your dad's lawyer, he must be older than you. How much older? 10 years, Amelia admitted. Wow, Caleb said, shaking his head, his eyes wide in amazement. Hey, Amelia said, slapping his hand playfully, loving the way the lantern light played across the green of Caleb's eyes. I'm not judging, Caleb said, laughing and holding up his free hand. I guess some women just like the wrinkly feeling of older men. Dale is not wrinkly, Amelia protested, her words slightly slurred. He may have a few creases, yes, but he is still tall and strong. He's a decent and wonderful man. Good for you, Caleb replied, his own words slurring as well. If that's what you like. Amelia was beginning to feel lightheaded. Wow, she breathed, pulling at the front of her shirt, trying to cool off. This stuff is strong. Yeah, Caleb nodded, refilling their cups once more. Where were we? Amelia asked, trying to remember what they had been talking about. You were telling me about Mr. Wrinkly Bits, Caleb chuckled. Stop, Amelia said, lazily punching him in the arm. Okay, whose turn is it? Caleb asked. I don't know, Amelia said, you go. Caleb looked at her for a long time, his mind undressing her slowly, lingering on her breasts, unable to think of a question that wasn't lecherous. Pass, he said, lifting his cup to his mouth, wishing it was Amelia's lips instead of the wooden mug. Okay, Amelia said, reaching for the bottle, her fingers caressing the smooth neck, wondering if Caleb was circumcised or not. I want to know. Do you get lonely out here? Sometimes, Caleb sighed, never having thought about it before. Sometimes I miss having someone to talk to. What about sex? Amelia asked, stunned by her own question. What about it? Caleb said, his head lolling slightly to one side as his hand caressed up Amelia's arm. Do you miss it? She pushed, feeling the goosebumps rise all over her body. Well, yeah, Caleb said. What about you? Does Mr. Wrinkly satisfy? Don't call him that, Amelia said, standing up indignantly, swaying slightly. Dale is a wonderful man. Catching her by the wrist, Caleb stood and pulled her towards him with such force that she ended up pressed against him as the stumble against the wall. He may be a good man, he slurred, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. But does he satisfy you? Not recently, Amelia breathed, closing the minuscule distance between them. Caleb's kiss was deep and demanding, his arms encircling her in a crushing embrace. Amelia returned his kiss, her own arms snaking around his neck. She felt him shudder as she wove her fingers through his hair, grabbing handfuls of it. Caleb began to frantically pull at buttons and zippers, wanting desperately to feel Amelia's naked body again. Turning, he pinned her to the wall, savoring the feel of her body against him. Oh God, he groaned, trying desperately to get her top off. Amelia dug her nails deeply into Caleb's back, hearing his moans of pain and pleasure. He gave up on being patient with the buttons and pulled the shirt the rest of the way open. Buttons popped off, scattering around the room. My God, Caleb breathed, looking at her beautiful full breasts. Then he was kissing her again, his hands massaging them, rough thumbs circling each nipple, feeling them harden. Amelia laid her head on Caleb's shoulder, wave after wave of pleasure coursing through her body. How long had it been since she and Dale had made love? Weeks? Months? She couldn't remember. Caleb felt wonderful against her body, his solidness holding her against the wall. She could feel his arousal against her stomach as she felt herself getting moist in her most intimate places. Oh God, she wanted him. With a grunt of effort, she pulled herself clumsily up and wrapped her legs around his waist. With a growl of lust, Caleb's hands left her breasts and cupped her under each buttock, enjoying the soft roundness of them. Barely able to control his need, he carried Amelia to his bed and laid her down on it, her legs still around him. He almost peaked when she started writhing against him, whimpering and moaning out her desire. With quick work, Caleb disentangled himself from her legs and removed the rest of her clothes, his own soon following. As he climbed back on top of her, ready to plunge into her welcoming body, he stopped, looking longingly down at her. What's wrong? Amelia panted, need aching between her legs. Nothing, he breathed, sliding easily into her moist opening. It had been so long since he'd felt the delicious warmth of the female body, he couldn't believe he'd gone so long without it. Caleb was hard-pressed to remember when he'd last had sex, with the exclusion of masturbation. Amelia wrapped her legs around him, pulling him tightly to her, reveling in how tight and strong his body was. Her mind tried to compare Caleb with Dale, but she forced the thought away, not wanting to think about him. Caleb's thrusts grew in intensity, the animalistic growls growing in volume the closer he got to climax. Amelia came, digging her nails deeply into Caleb's back as stars exploded behind her eyes. Caleb grabbed under her shoulders, seeking leverage for a final deep thrust that brought his own release. In the heat of his own passion, Caleb didn't hear her whimper of pain as he pulled against her, his need overriding everything else. Harder and harder he dragged at her, the feeling of relief overwhelming him as he finally came, his body shuddering as he slumped against Amelia, his breathing ragged. Panting, he stayed like that, sweat rolling over his skin, quickly sapping the heat of his passion away, leaving him chilled and shivering. Rolling to his side, Caleb gathered Amelia to him, nuzzling his face in her hair. She listened to Caleb as his breathing slowed, turning into soft snores in her ear. Tears rolled down her cheeks, the pain in her shoulder rippling through her body. She tried to keep her pain silent, but Caleb heard her sniffles and sobs as tried to.
Chapter 15.
Amelia woke slowly, the pounding in her head forcing her to consciousness. As she sat up, the world began to spin, causing her to moan in pain. "Caleb," she said, her eyes closed against the lantern light. "Please tell me you found something for hangovers in that first aid kit." When no answer came, she slowly opened one eye and looked where Caleb had been sleeping. The bed was empty, and she realized he wasn't even in the cabin. Slowly, Amelia moved to the edge of the bed, draping her legs over the side. With deliberate movements, doing her best to avoid jostling her head and making the pain worse. As she pulled on clothes from her bag, Amelia had to stifle a scream of agony as lightning shot through her body from her shoulder. Breathing heavily, she clutched at her shoulder, unable to decide which part of her body hurt worse. Finally pulling on her pants, she slipped her feet into her boots, not bothering to tie them, sweat pouring down her forehead. Still breathing raggedly, she stumbled to the door, pulling it open to be struck by a new round of pain in her head as the small bit of sunlight was amplified by the snow, its brightness boring into her eyes. Looking through her fingers, she saw Caleb moving through the trees that circled the cabin. Not wanting to put her head through the pain of calling for him, she carefully moved down the steps towards where she'd seen him last, her boots sinking into the snow. When she reached the bottom step, she lost sight of him. "Caleb," she called, unable to think of any other way to get his attention, cringing at the stab of pain that shot through her head. He stepped out of the tree line, walking past her to the cabin. Stopping at the bottom of the steps, he finally stopped to look at her. "What do you need?" he asked. "I was hoping you had something for hangovers," she said, cradling her head in her hand. "Something that isn't whiskey-laced tea." "Yeah," he said, stepping up and into the cabin, leaving her to follow him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, following him inside, grateful for the darkness inside. Crawling back under the blankets, cradling her arm, she watched him dig through the first aid kit he'd brought from the crash. "I was burying the rest of that damn liquor," he said, handing her a small packet of aspirin. "Caleb," she said, gratefully accepting the pills. "Can we talk about last night?" "There's nothing to talk about," Caleb said so loudly, Amelia winced in pain. "Yes there is," she said, trying to ignore her head. "No, there isn't," he said firmly, turning his back on her. "Caleb," she said, tears filling her eyes. "Caleb, please. We have to live together for who knows how long. We can't have something like this coming between us. Please." Finally turning to face her, she could see how haggard his face was. "Amelia," he said, his shoulders sagging, "last night was a mistake. We were drunk." Amelia was confused by his sudden change in behavior. Last night he'd been all over her, his lips, his hands, his eyes, he'd devoured her. Today he could barely stand to look at her. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, confused. "I heard you crying," he said flatly, his voice angry. "Oh," she breathed, looking down, embarrassed that he knew he'd hurt her. "Do you think we can live here together without this becoming a problem?" she asked, not understanding what he meant. "I will feed you, protect you, and teach you what you need to know to stay alive until the plane comes," Caleb said flatly. "I promise that I will behave as a gentleman, and after this conversation, last night will be forgotten. Okay." With a heavy sigh, Amelia held out her hand good to him. "Okay," she said, grateful when he returned her handshake. Their life together in the Alaskan bush began again.
Chapter 16.
As fall turned into winter, and the darkness became omnipresent, Amelia found it hard to know when the day ended and night began. Caleb tried to help, keeping them on a strict schedule of trapping, tanning and wilderness crafts, though this did little to ease the sexual tension between them. They both tried hard to minimize their physical contact, keeping as far apart as the little cabin would allow, but it was difficult. In such close quarters, they were bound to touch, especially when they worked at their crafts, which was most of the time. He taught her how to make buttons out of elk and deer antlers using a small jeweler's saw to slice the bone into thin discs. He then instructed her in using a hand awl to create the holes. While she worked on these, Caleb carved the most intricate designs into moose antlers, usually showing scenes of nature. Most of these antlers, Caleb explained, he found discarded in the woods throughout the early spring and summer. Since the animals shed them every year and grew new ones, he'd managed to collect several dozens of each species and saved them for the long dark winter days to keep him occupied. "Can I try something?" Amelia asked one day, indicating one of the smaller moose antlers he'd set aside, deeming it not right for his current project. She'd just finished her 20th button and needed a change. Sure, Caleb shrugged, holding out the basket of antlers towards her. Thanks, she replied, taking it, her hand brushing his. Standing quickly, he excused himself and walked out into the dark snowy night, mumbling an apology, closing the door firmly behind him. Amelia sat, stunned, wondering what she'd done this time. Usually she knew what she'd done to make him need to go outside for alone time, but this time she was at a loss. She'd barely brushed him. Turning her head away from the door in confusion, she noticed that Caleb had left without his rifle or revolver. Shit, she sighed, grabbing them both. If there was one thing that Caleb had drilled into her brain to the point of compulsion, it was that you never went outside without protection. Even just a trip to the outhouse required a sidearm. Slinging his rifle over her shoulder, Amelia held the handgun in one hand and grabbed a lantern with the other. Caleb, she called, opening the door. The chilled winter wind almost knocked her over as she stepped outside, its bitter teeth biting through her clothes. Squinting against the stinging air, she scanned the clearing, looking for him. Caleb, she repeated, raising her voice louder. From her left came a gut-rending cry of pain mixed with the snarls of an animal. Running in that direction, she found Caleb sitting in a pool of blood, a large tree branch grasped in one hand. Near him was a wolf, whining as it tried to crawl away, its back legs dragging behind it. "Oh God," she cried, shooting the wolf in the back of the head before rushing to Caleb's side. "Get up," she ordered, keeping her gun arm up while trying to pull him to his feet. "Damn bitch," Caleb said, grunting as he found his feet. "What?" she asked, almost losing her grip on him. "The wolf, not you," he clarified, hopping on one leg as she helped him back to the cabin. Getting him inside, Amelia helped him to a chair before bolting the door. "Why did you leave without your gun?" she asked, rolling up his pant leg. "I forgot," he replied, wincing. "You forgot?" She laughed. "After all of those lectures you gave me, you forgot." "Yes," he yelled as she gingerly probed his leg. "Oh, don't be such a baby," she chastised. "She didn't even break the skin. I guess all that blood was hers." "I didn't want to hurt her," he said, leaning back in the chair, "but she just kept coming." "You still didn't answer my question," Amelia pushed. "Why did you go outside?" "It was nothing," Caleb replied, shaking his head. "Don't lie," she said, standing up to look down at him. "What did I do to make you need to leave?" "I touched you," he said, his voice shaking. "I just needed a moment alone." "Fuck it," she breathed, tired of denying them both what they needed. Reaching down, she cupped his face, her lips seeking his. With a growl, Caleb wrapped his arms around her. Her lips were as soft and delicious as he remembered. In one move, he rose and crossed the room to his bed, carrying Amelia with him. His kisses were deep and desperate, his need overcoming his gentler nature. He needed her, wanted her, and the thought that she would leave him and never return was too much to bear. Amelia knew she shouldn't be doing this, but the feel of Caleb's muscular arms around her made everything else outside this small cabin fade into nothingness. She wanted this almost as much as he did. He tasted of raw earthiness, of wood smoke and leather, everything a man should be and more. She heard herself whimper with desire as her arms snaked around his neck and wrapping her legs around his waist once more. Feeling her legs around him, Caleb forgot about everything else, but the thought of having her quickly stripped off their clothes. He moaned with ecstasy as he finally entered her warm slit, almost coming instantly. He wanted Amelia to enjoy this too, but over the last 3 months, his need and desire for her had built to such a point that he couldn't contain it. With 3 more thrusts he came, his entire body shaking with relief. "I'm sorry," he panted, looking down at her beautiful face. "I'm sorry. I couldn't stop." "It's okay," Amelia said, sadness clouding her face. "No," Caleb whispered, kissing her neck. "No, it's not. You deserve more," he continued as he kissed his way up to lips then down to her breasts. "Let me show you." Caleb began to slowly kiss every inch of her creamy skin, suckling longingly on each of her breasts. This time he was slow and deliberate, making sure that Amelia enjoyed every moment of his attention. "Caleb," she moaned as he nibbled the tender pink tips, feeling him hardening again against her thigh. Slowly, he entered her, feeling how wet and ready she was for him. The pressure was soon building in him again, but he pushed it down with all his might as he fought to hold himself in check until Amelia had a chance to climax. He could feel her muscles tighten around his shaft as she raked her nails across his back, her moans of pleasure turning into cries of "Caleb, Caleb," as she finally came, sending him over the edge with her. They lay there, still joined, neither wanting this moment of perfect contentment to end. Caleb was marveling at how wonderful it felt to be this close to another human being. For 7 years he'd lived alone and never once had he wanted to share his life with anyone. Then one day a plane carrying the most perfect gift the Alaskan bush had ever given him crashed in his mountains, bringing to him this woman. Amelia had forgotten sex could be so wonderful. Dale was adequate in bed, though more often than not he was too tired to even try. Caleb, on the other hand, dear God, she had lost count of how many times she'd come for him. By the time he was completely satisfied, they were both panting and slightly dehydrated. Looking at the water bucket, he sighed. I need to go get some water, he said, grabbing the bucket and walking into the dark Alaskan night completely naked, but this time carrying his gun. Amelia snuggled down under the bearskin blanket, sleepily listening to the tink, tink, tink of melting snow that dripped off of the stovepipe. When Caleb returned, he set the bucket near the stove and scooped some snow into a pot to boil. When that was done, he crawled under the fur with her, causing her to yelp in surprise as his ice-cold hands wrapped themselves around her. Sorry, he said with a husky laugh. No, you're not, she replied, turning so she could be face to face with him. I'm so glad your plane crashed, he sighed, caressing her cheek. I could have lived without it, Amelia laughed, thinking about how different his life would have been if she'd made it to the oil fields. Well, he said, sitting up on his elbow to look down at her, you're stuck here now. Caleb, she said with a heavy sigh, this doesn't change anything. I still need to go home when the plane comes. Why? He asked, his face clouding over. I'll take care of you. I can make this place bigger if you want, he said, indicating the cabin around him. I have a bunch of extra furs I can sell in Fairbanks thanks to you, and most of the money I've made over the last 7 years is sitting in a bank account just collecting interest. We can use that money to make this place however you want it. I'll get a generator, some solar panels, anything. I can't, Caleb, she said, reaching up and stroking his hairy cheek. I have to go back. Dale. Forget him, Caleb breathed, placing his hand on hers. You can stay with me. Caleb, please, Amelia sighed. This isn't easy for me. All right, he sighed in resignation, his finger tracing lines across her skin. But until then, he said, leaning down and kissing her, his cold hands finding its way down to her still throbbing opening. Until then, you're mine.
Chapter 17.
Hey, Amelia said, waking up one morning 2 months later. What? Caleb said, sitting bolt upright next to her. The sun, Amelia cried, climbing over him, and bounding out of bed moving to the window. Oh, Caleb sighed, yawning and lying back down. Come on, Caleb, Amelia chided, get up and look at this. I've never seen anything so beautiful. Amelia, we've had the sunlight for weeks now, Caleb said tiredly. I know, Amelia said, her voice singing, but I can actually see the edge of the sun over the mountain. Yay, Caleb said, putting his pillow over his head. Amelia turned to look at him, and paused. Of course he would not rejoice in the return of the sun. Its coming meant that she was that much closer to leaving him alone. In the last 4 months, they had spent almost every hour of every day together. Caleb had taught her how to trap, and while she had originally thought the process barbaric, she'd grown to enjoy the challenge of it. Setting the trap, and the anticipation of success were intoxicating in a way she had never expected. So far she had added 9 foxes, 12 hares, 3 muskrat and what Caleb claimed was the largest marten he had ever seen. In addition to trapping, Caleb had introduced her to animal tracking, showing her the different paw prints, scat, and where elk, moose and bear rubbed up against the trees. Amelia found this fascinating, and using a small pad of paper she found in her bag, she took pieces of charcoal from the stove and began drawing everything around her, the mountains, the cabin interior, even Caleb himself. It was a hobby she'd enjoyed as a teen, but since college she hadn't had much time to indulge in it. Being alone with Caleb, she found she had all the time in the world. Too soon she had used every inch of the pad, and with a sigh set the hobby aside. Though she'd begun carving antlers with him, and her work was stunning, he knew she missed drawing. One morning Caleb woke earlier than usual and began a long hike to a grove of birch trees 5 miles away. He'd watch for hours on end while Amelia drew, fascinated by her skill and eye for detail. He'd even thought about asking her if he could hang her drawings around the cabin, but held back the request. In just a month or more she would be going, and he didn't think he could take having her pictures hanging around him when she was gone. He watched her as she sat for hours on end drawing while he processed the meat and furs they had collected. He'd seen how sad she was when her little notepad was too full to draw in anymore and decided he would surprise her with the bark. I'm gonna go check the trap line, he said, pulling on his boots while she was still in bed. Can I go with you? Amelia asked, tiredly rubbing her eyes, delighted at the idea of going on a trek through the woods. Not this trip, Caleb said, reaching for his gun. It's faster if I go alone. Okay, Amelia replied, confused by why he didn't want her to go with him. As he reached for his pack, Amelia reached out her hand to him. Be careful, she said, holding onto his hand. Caleb gently squeezed her fingers and nodded his assurance. Quickly, she reached up and planted a kiss on his cheek. Hurry back, she said, blushing at her impulsive act. That night when Caleb returned, he brought with him not only 2 foxes, but also a large stack of birch wood tightly bound with rope. What is this? Amelia asked, turning from the stove, accepting the bundle he offered. I noticed you'd used the last of your notepad, he explained, and while your carvings are wonderful, I went to a birch grove near our trap line and got you some bark to draw on. Thank you, Amelia cried, dropping the bundle on the table and embracing him. Caleb's arms encircled her, enjoying the feel of her body against his. As they stood there, he breathed in her smell, trying to lock it in his memory. Thank you, she repeated, turning to the table and untying the twine. Taking each piece out and laying them according to their size, she hummed to herself in joy. Some of the pieces were small scraps, while others were the size of legal paper. It was wonderful, with these she could draw for her heart's content. Caleb was so wonderful. He smiled to himself as he unlaced his boots, seeing how happy such a simple gift could make her. While he'd originally thought of Amelia as nothing more than a burden he'd have to shoulder, he now thought of her as a nice distraction to come home to.
Chapter 18.
How's this one? Amelia asked, showing Caleb her most recent drawing. She'd drawn a picture of a moose they'd seen down at the water's edge. It's nice, Caleb replied, with a rueful smile. It would have been nicer if he were hanging in the smoke shed though. I know, Amelia sighed, putting the drawing down. But he was so beautiful and majestic. Yeah, Caleb agreed. But I really wanted his liver. She said, packing her picture away. As she stood, movement outside caught her attention. Looking out the window, Amelia smiled. You might get your chance, she said, pointing. Looks like he's back. Jumping to his feet, Caleb moved to stand next to her. Amelia was right, the moose was back at the lake drinking his fill. Turning her around and lifting her face, Caleb kissed her deeply. Warm up the stove, he said, reaching for his rifle. We're having liver tonight. With that, he quietly opened the cabin door and slipped out into the wilderness, rifle in hand. Amelia stared after him, pleased with the kiss and sickened at the thought of moose liver for dinner. Every time she thought about it, a shiver went through her body. Yuck, she thought, as she began stoking the stove. Caleb slid soundlessly across the clearing with practiced steps. As he inched into range, he pulled his rifle to his shoulder, and with one shot, took the bull to the ground. Feeling like a kid again, he went back to the cabin and beckoned Amelia to join him. I could really use your help with this, he called, grabbing his skinning knives. Not sure if she really wanted to be part of this, but having no real excuse, Amelia steeled her nerves and went outside. While she was okay with the smaller animals, the job of skinning and gutting the larger ones still made her nauseous. We need to pull him away from the lake before we butcher him, Caleb said, tying a rope to the moose's front feet. We don't want his blood or entrails polluting our drinking water. Okay, she agreed, grabbing the offered end of rope. With a great amount of effort, the two of them managed to drag the moose several yards away from the water to a small natural divot in the clearing. That should do it, Caleb said, pulling out his honing stone. Could you run up to the meat shed and grab the cart? It will make it easier to haul this guy's pieces back. Amelia wiped the sweat running from her brow and did as he asked. Caleb was already removing the animal's innards and putting the offal into waiting buckets. When he came to the liver, he cut a small slice and offered it to her. Amelia took a step back and shook her head. I'm not hungry enough to try it, she said, putting her hands up in front of her. Come on, Caleb cajoled. It really is very good. I can't, Amelia said, a look of revulsion on her face. Suit yourself, Caleb shrugged and ate the piece himself, dark blood running down his chin. Oh, Amelia moaned, turning green and running towards the bushes. Are you okay? He asked, following her. Yes, she managed to say between riches, waving him away. Caleb backed away, concerned about her, but wanting to respect her wishes. Okay, she said, wiping her chin on her sleeve. That was gross. Are you sure you're okay? He asked, rubbing his hand up and down her arm. Yeah, Amelia replied, taking several deep breaths. That was just really gross. Amelia, Caleb said seriously, looking down at her. Out here is no place to take a chance with you health. I'm fine, she assured him, putting on a weak smile. Do you think you can help me with the rest? Caleb asked seriously. Or do you need to go inside? No, she said, shaking her head. I can do it. All right, he said, taking her hand, leading the way back to the moose. Quickly he put the liver in a bucket with the animal's tongue and heart and set it aside before Amelia had to see them. She watched in fascination as he expertly sliced and peeled the hide, removing it in one seamless piece. Without being asked, Amelia took the skin from him and moved it to his processing station, suppressing the urge to throw up again. The musky smell of the animal clawed at her nose, trying to reach into her stomach. Taking several deep breaths, she was able to keep her gag reflex in check, but only with the greatest effort. When that part was done, Caleb took his knife and began to cut at the hindquarters. Freeing the first one, he asked Amelia to help him get it onto the sled. While she hauled it back, Caleb continued to cut, taking everything edible from the carcass. He then removed the antlers for bleaching and with a sigh at a job well done stood. Amelia had just returned from her last trip hauling the smaller cuts of meat, leaving the large rib sections for them to move together. It took 3 more trips with both of them straining under the weight of their bounty to get the rest of the animal back to the shed and hung away from other predators, until he could slice and preserve it. They were both covered in blood by the time they were done. Now, Caleb said, wiping the blood from his knives, I just need to get these innards and the few bones that are left and use the sled to drag them as far from here as I can. Help me load up. Sure, she said, lifting a bucket of offal with a grunt. Wanna go with me? He asked when they were done. If you don't mind, Amelia said, looking down at her blood-covered clothes. I think I'm gonna stay behind and clean up a bit. You probably should, Caleb smiled. You seem to have gotten blood smeared on your face. What? She asked, putting her hand to her cheek. Where? Here, he laughed, surging forward and running his sticky wet hands down her cheeks. You, she said, moving aggressively towards him. I'm gonna get you. She chased Caleb around the clearing, not sure what she was going to do to him, but she'd think of something. Caleb banked left, then right, laughing uproariously at her expression. He ran straight into the water, sure Amelia wouldn't dare follow. Unfortunately, he'd underestimated how much she wanted to get him. With a final leap she tackled him, knocking him backwards into the water. It was chilly, but nothing compared to what it had been the night he fell through the ice. They wrestled in the water until cold and exhaustion left them standing hip-deep in the water, their arms locked in combat. You suck, she said, her lips turning blue. Only if you ask nicely, he replied, pulling her into his arms. Their kiss was slow and passionate, their hands roaming freely across each other's body. I think I'm in love with you, Caleb said, when their kiss ended. Caleb, she sighed, her head falling onto his chest. Amelia, he said, hooking her chin with his finger. I know you still plan to leave, and that is something I have to come to terms with, but you have to let me tell you how I feel. Before she could reply, he was kissing her again, a kiss that was so passionate, Amelia felt herself getting weak at the knees. When the chill of the water finally forced them back to dry land, Caleb pulled the remains of the moose away from camp while Amelia stayed behind. While he was gone, Amelia began mixing a batch of flatbread he'd taught her to make, hoping it would help settle her stomach. Returning, Caleb cooked up a heart and tongue stew which Amelia grudgingly ate, but he couldn't get her to touch the liver. Even discussing it made her turn green and dry heave, so he dropped it completely. That night, they made love again, each of them unable to get enough of the other, neither of them wanting to think about her looming departure.
Chapter 19.
I think I hear a plane, Amelia said, dropping the rabbit she'd been skinning and running through the trees towards the lake. It's not due for another 2 weeks, Caleb called after her, sadness filling his heart. From the sound, he knew she was right, it was a plane. Caleb ran up to her, turning her to look at him. I don't want you to leave, he said, wrapping his arms around her waist trying to pull her back to the cover of pine trees. It's not up to you, Amelia said, tears welling in her eyes as she pulled away from him. I have a life out there, Caleb. I have a fiancé, friends. I can't stay here, and you can't make me. Amelia, Caleb said, pulling her back into his arms, kissing her face frantically. Amelia, please don't go. No one out there knows you survived the crash. We can stay here forever, just you and me. Go hide in the woods, the pilot will never know. I'll go with him to sell our pelts and crafts, then come back. I'll be gone for 2 days tops. Struggling to escape his iron embrace, Amelia sobbed. No, she said harshly, shaking his hands off, running towards the lake. No, Caleb, please don't. I am going home. Hearing the plane touch down on the water, Caleb knew it was too late, the pilot had seen her. Amelia, he cried, tears in his eyes. I love you. I'm sorry, she replied, turning back to him. I need to go. Without another word she ran for the lake, her arms waving frantically in the air. Caleb watched her run away from him, his heart breaking as she got further and further away. Though he'd known the plane was due soon, he'd been praying that it would never arrive. Any time he let himself think of Amelia leaving, he couldn't imagine his life going back to the way it was. He'd be alone again, which a few months ago wouldn't have bothered him, but now it seemed like a death sentence. The bright Alaskan sun shone through the window as Amelia packed the rest of her things back in her duffel bag. She'd separated out the stuff Caleb had lent her, not wanting to take anything he might need. She lovingly rubbed the fur mittens he'd help her make from one of the rabbits she'd helped trap. Putting them aside in Caleb's pile of things, she closed the flap and pulled the zipper closed. "The pilot is ready to go," Caleb said, standing at the door, wanting nothing more than to lock it closed and keep Amelia from leaving. "We just loaded the last of my things." Seeing she was done packing, he stepped in, reaching around her and picked up her bag. "Caleb," she said, touching his arm, "please understand. If I didn't have a life to go back to, I would love to stay here with you, but I do have a life. A fiancé. Hell, a company to go back to." "I know," he said, sadness choking his voice. "Come on, the pilot wants to take off before it gets too late." Looking around the room, she saw nothing else that was hers. She reached out a hand, reverently touching the caribou hide on the bed, remembering the nights she had spent under it with Caleb. The feel of his body as they explored each other's bodies. Steeling herself, Amelia straightened her shoulders and walked back into her life, closing not only the cabin door, but also the door on her heart. As the plane touched down in Anchorage, Amelia released her death grip on Caleb's hand and thanked God they'd made it safely. On the flight, the pilot couldn't stop talking excitedly about what a hero he was going to be. He explained that a massive search was launched when her plane was reported missing, but they'd been looking over 100 miles north of where it had actually gone down. "Wow," she breathed. "Any word about my fiancé, Dale Hamilton?" "Oh, him," the pilot replied over the sound of the engine. "He was paying every bush pilot he could find double, sometimes at triple their usual rate, to fly him out there so he could look for you." "He did?" she asked, not surprised to hear he'd kept the search going. "Yeah," the pilot confirmed. He didn't want to give up, but after a while even the greediest pilot started telling him it was hopeless. He finally went back to Texas after 2 months, a broken man. "Oh, Dale," Amelia sighed, looking out the window at the approaching cityscape. Caleb reached out slowly, making sure the pilot didn't notice, his hand searching for hers. "Don't," she hissed, pulling hers out of reach. When they landed, Amelia was immediately surrounded by reporters, camera crews, and state troopers, the questions coming hard and fast. As the crowd pressed in, she lost sight of Caleb as she was herded towards the terminal. Over and over she told the story of her survival in the wilderness with the help of Caleb. At the mention of his name, the reporters doing the interview paused and looked at each other. "Do you mean Caleb Dulac?" one of them asked. "Yes," Amelia affirmed. "His last name is Dulac." "I thought he was dead," the reporter said. "Of course, if anyone could survive out there, it would be him." "Well," the other concluded, "I think we have everything we need." As the mob dispersed, Amelia looked for Caleb and saw him moving his bundles of furs and leathers from the plane into the back of a very beat-up truck. As she tried to move towards him, she was intercepted by a state trooper. "If you have a moment, ma'am," he said, stepping in front of her. "We have a few questions to ask you about the crash." "Can it wait?" she asked, trying to step around him. "I just need a second to talk to Caleb." "Caleb?" he asked, turning to see who she was talking about. "Dulac," he yelled, waving his arm. "Son of a bitch, it that you?" "Hey Glenn," Caleb called, a smile flashing on his face as he closed the tailgate. The two men crossed the short distance, clasping hands and embracing. Though she couldn't hear what they were saying, Amelia was sure they were talking about old times. Soon they were joined by other troopers, and Caleb was once again lost to her. "Ma'am," she heard someone say behind her, "I can take your statement." Amelia turned to see a younger trooper standing behind her. "Aren't you going to join the reunion?" she asked, motioning to the crowd around Caleb. "I will, ma'am," the young man replied. "I just thought you might like to get this part over so you can get out of here." "Thank you," she said with a heavy sigh, glad to finally see the end of this nightmare. When she was done giving her statement, the trooper closed his notebook and looked over at the group still circling around Caleb. "We've contacted your fiancé," he said absently, wanting to join the conversation. "He sent a message that his secretary made reservations for you at the hotel Captain Hook, and that he was going to catch the first flight out." "Can I call him?" Amelia asked. "He said he would call you at the hotel when he reached his first layover," the trooper explained. "Okay," Amelia sighed, deflated. "There's a car waiting to drive you to your hotel now if you like," he said, indicating a town car parked next to a nearby hangar. "Thank you," Amelia said, taking one more look towards Caleb. Knowing that a clean break was better, if not less painful, she shook the trooper's hand and reached for her bag.
Chapter 20.
By the time she reached her suite, Amelia felt as if she'd been put through a meat grinder. She was so tired she wanted nothing more than to fall in bed, but she really needed a shower first. Looking at herself in the mirror, Amelia was shocked at the changes in her appearance. It had been months since she'd seen her reflection in anything clearer than the surface of the lake. The roots of her blonde hair had grown out over 3 inches, revealing her natural deep brown color. The skin of her face and arms had browned deeply in the Alaskan sunlight, a stark contrast to the paleness of the rest of her body. Her once slim figure had a muscular roundness to it, especially her upper arms and thighs. "So much for my personal trainer," she thought, examining the rippling play of muscles under the skin. Standing under the spray of hot water coming from the shower head in her suite, Amelia finally allowed herself to break down and cry. She cried everything out. Being brought back to civilization, wanting desperately to hear Dale's voice, and worst of all, leaving Caleb. The 6 months she'd spent with him were some of the happiest months she'd had in years, and the last 3 being the best. Their lovemaking had filled her heart with so much joy, a joy she was now emptying into the shower drain. Wrapped in a soft robe, Amelia looked out at the Anchorage skyline, wondering what she would do now. Of course she'd go back to Houston, back to Dale, but what then? She wasn't sure she would ever feel the happiness there the way she'd felt it before. In her heart, she knew she'd found a new happiness, greater than anything she'd ever know could exist. How was she supposed to push down those feelings and return to a relationship that had become prosaic? As these thoughts and many others tumbled through her brain, the phone rang. With a trembling hand, Amelia reached for it. "Amelia, Amelia darling, is that you?" Dale asked, his deep voice breaking. "Yes, Dale, it's me," Amelia sobbed, tears of joy mingling with tears of sorrow and regret as she collapsed onto the sofa. "Oh, Dale, I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too," Dale sobbed. "When the troopers called me to tell me you'd been found, I couldn't believe it." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied, "just really tired." "My darling," Dale said, another tremor in his voice. "We can talk more tomorrow. I'm in Winnipeg right now. There are no more commercial flights out tonight, but I've hired a jet to fly me the rest of the way. The pilot said it will be about 2 hours before we can take off. I'll be in Anchorage by tomorrow morning. You take a long hot bath and get a good night's sleep, okay?" "I'll be waiting," Amelia replied. "Hurry, Dale." Dropping the phone back in its cradle, Amelia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. How would she be able to face him? Adultery was such an ugly word to describe the absolute ecstasy she'd shared with Caleb. Shaking her head, Amelia vowed that from that moment forward, she would never think or speak of how intimate she and Caleb had really become. As far as the world, and most importantly Dale, would know, Caleb was just the man who'd saved her life and kept her alive until his resupply plane arrived.
Chapter 21.
As Caleb finished his last beer, he shook the hands of troopers that had insisted on taking him out for drinks. He'd hoped to be able to spend a few more hours with Amelia, but she'd left the airport as soon as the troopers finished their interview, and he'd been too distracted by his former co-workers to stop her. Stepping into the noisy Anchorage night, he tried to take a deep breath, but the stifling air of the city choked him. The noise of cars, the people, all of it was overwhelming. Usually when he came to town, he went from the airport to his buyers, then back to the airport motel for a night before his pilot took him back to the Brooks Range. But tonight the troopers had insisted they treat him to a drink. Now he found himself alone in a city he'd left behind him years ago. Places he'd once frequented were gone, replaced by franchises and chain stores. Hailing a cab, he first gave the driver the name of his motel, but as they drove through downtown, he saw the hotel the troopers had told him Amelia had gone to. Without thinking it over, he asked the driver to take him there instead. Paying the driver, he stumbled out of the taxi and staggered to the check-in desk. "Could you please tell me what room Amelia Hamilton is in?" he asked the Inuit woman standing behind the counter. "Oh," she replied with a smile, "you must be her fiancé. We weren't expecting you until the morning." "Yes," Caleb lied. "Could you tell me what room Amelia is in?" "Ms. Hamilton is in the penthouse," the clerk replied, sliding a key card across the counter to him. "Here's your key." "Thanks," he said, taking the key and moving towards the elevator. On the ride up, he considered forgetting the whole thing and just going to his motel, but as the elevator door opened, he abandoned that train of thought. Almost running, Caleb made his way to the door of Amelia's room. Sliding the key into the lock, Caleb quietly slipped into the hotel room. On unsteady feet, he made his way around the sitting room furniture, heading towards the light coming from the bedroom. Pushing the door open, he saw Amelia standing at the window, looking out at the Anchorage skyline. On silent feet, Caleb moved to stand behind her. "One more night," he whispered into her ear. "Please." Without a word, Amelia turned into his arms, pulling his lips to hers. His arms wound around her waist, as he hugged her tightly to him as her fingers entwined themselves into his hair. "How did you know it was me?" he asked when she finally stopped kissing him. "I've been praying for you to come to me all night," she sobbed, planting kisses all over his face. Their lovemaking that night was passionate and slow, each wanting to draw out their time together. Caleb wanted to draw this night out, to make sure there wasn't 1 inch of Amelia's flesh that he hadn't touched. From the tips of her toes to the roots of her hair he kissed and licked, caressed and loved, never wanting to forget a single detail of her body. When they had finally reached their last climax, Caleb pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Amelia," he said into her hair. "I love you too, Caleb," she replied, turning her tear-streaked face into his embrace. "I should leave," he said half an hour later, his eyes getting heavy with sleep. "Not yet," she sighed, tightening her hold on his waist. "I'm not ready." "Amelia," he said, his voice husky with longing. "If I don't go now, I'm never going to let you go." "I know," she sobbed, loosening her grasp on him. As Caleb dressed, Amelia couldn't keep from crying into his still warm pillow. "Amelia," he said, sitting down on the bed next to her, his hand resting on her shaking shoulder. "Just go," she sobbed, "please." "I will always love you," he said softly, kissing her cheek. Closing the door behind him, Caleb heaved a deep sigh. He wanted nothing more than to go back into that room and never let Amelia go, but she had made her choice, and it wasn't him. Exiting the elevator, he blindly walked out of Amelia's life forever. Hailing a taxi, he rode silently to his own motel, his sadness and anger vying with each other for control of his soul. Once in his room, he threw himself on his bed and screamed into the mattress, venting his rage until his throat was raw. The rest of his night was spent trashing his room, breaking everything he could manage to get his hands on. The chair was left in splinters, the lamps shattered and ground into the carpet under his boots, the television had a sizable hole from his foot kicking its screen in. When his rage was spent, Caleb collapsed onto the gritty carpet and sobbed until he passed out from exhaustion.
Chapter 22.
Amelia cried herself to sleep when Caleb was gone. She wished she'd never gotten on that plane half a year ago. That anyone else had been able to take that trip instead of her, but on second thought no, she didn't wish that. It had been a miracle she'd survived the crash, let alone the journey down the mountain. She could still smell him on the pillow, still feel his arms around her. What was she going to do? Dale would be here in just a few hours and she had just made love to another man that she wanted more than her own fiancé. Unable to sleep, she got out of bed and dressed. Thankfully the hotel had laundered her clothes and provided her with a pile of new ones based on sizes Dale's secretary had provided. She'd found among these items a sweater with an Inuit design stitched on it, leggings and yummy velour socks that made her feet feel like she was walking on clouds. Sitting on the sofa, she simply stared out at the cityscape, her hand propping up her head, hating everything she saw. The buildings distracted from the beauty of the wilderness around them, the snow was gray and dingy instead of sparkling white. It was all wrong, all too dirty. She wanted to cry, but she was all cried out. Amelia jumped as the lock on her suite door clicked and Dale rushed in, dropping his suitcase, running to her. "Amelia," he said, pulling her into his warm embrace. "Oh, Amelia, I'm so glad you're alive." He was kissing her then, her cheeks, her forehead, her nose, and finally her lips. "Dale," she sobbed, "I've missed you so much." After a long embrace, they sat on the sofa holding each other's hand, the silence stretching out between them. Amelia couldn't believe how much he had aged since she'd last seen him. He seemed almost 15 years older. "I can't tell you how happy I am to see you," Dale said finally, squeezing her hand gently. "The trooper who called me said some hermit found you." "Caleb," Amelia nodded, returning the squeeze. "He used to a state trooper himself." "How did he find you?" he asked. "We searched and searched for weeks but found nothing. From what information I could get, the search party was looking over 100 miles west from where the plane actually crashed," she explained. "Caleb found me entirely by accident. After the crash, I stumbled out of the wreckage and somehow found a small cabin in the middle of the forest," she continued, a chill running through her at the memory. "I climbed in and passed out. Turns out it was one of Caleb's. He'd set it up for shelter while hunting, in case he couldn't get back to his main cabin. And that's where he found you. Dale breathed, pulling her into an embrace. Thank God for coincidence. They sat there for hours, just holding each other, relishing in being together. Finally Dale had to stand. Sorry, sweetie, he apologized. My sciatica is beginning to act up. Those commercial airline seats are horrible, even in first class. It's okay, Amelia said, brushing her hair out of her face. We should get moving anyway. Is there anything in Anchorage you want to do before we head back to Houston? He asked, offering her his hand to stand. I wish there was something we could do for Caleb, she sighed, but he's so independent and set in his ways. I don't know if there is anything we could do. Did you get the name of the bush pilot that flew you out? He asked. Yes, she nodded. Well, we can contact him and see if there are any supplies he thinks Caleb could use, and if there are, we could have them taken out to his, Dale offered. That would be perfect, Amelia said. If all else fails, we could pay for his supplies and the fees his pilot charges for the next few years. I know he works all winter trapping just to afford those. How about we do both? Dale said. He saved your life. Supplies and pilot fees are the least we can do. Thank you, she said, squeezing his hand. I'm gonna go pack. Okay, he said, kissing her forehead. I'm gonna order some coffee and breakfast. I haven't eaten anything except airport food since last night. Do you want anything? Sure, Amelia said from the bedroom. Bacon, eggs, and toast sounds wonderful. By the time she was done, there was a knock on the door and the wonderful smells of breakfast was wafting through the suite. As they ate, she and Dale made plans on what to send to Caleb. Amelia wished she could find a way to send a message to him telling him how much she wished things were different, but she thought it was better to just leave things alone. She was here with Dale and Caleb was going back to the wilderness where he belonged. After finishing their meal, she and Dale set out on a whirlwind shopping spree across Anchorage, purchasing anything Amelia and his pilot thought Caleb might need or be able to use. When she could think of nothing else, they made arrangements with the pilot to fly the lot out to Caleb as soon as the suppliers delivered them. The next morning, she and Dale boarded a plane and flew home, leaving Alaska and all of its memories behind. Dale had arranged for her company's corporate jet take them home, and with a heavy heart Amelia settled into her seat as it lifted off. She watched from the window as the world drifted by, her heart breaking more and more as the miles between her and Caleb increased. After touching down in Houston, Dale escorted her to the waiting limousine, and they began their long drive home. She was amazed at how different everything looked. The grass was the wrong shade of green, the trees were small and leafy instead of majestic and full of needles. Dale saw her confusion and did his best to alleviate her discomfort, offering her snacks and drinks. When that didn't work, he tried discussing business, only to lapse into silence once more. He wanted so much to see Amelia smile, but no matter what he tried failed. Everything about her was different. The further they were from Alaska, the more she seemed to fold in on herself. The staff welcomed Amelia home with such joy and jubilation, she was moved to tears. By the time she and Dale went to bed, she was exhausted beyond belief. She barely managed to pull on her nightdress before she collapsed into bed. Dale crawled in next to her and pulled her into his arms. Amelia, he said softly, stroking her cheek. What's wrong, my darling? I don't know, she sobbed. Everything just feels wrong. For the last 6 months all I wanted was to get home, but now that I'm here it doesn't feel right. Hush, sweetheart, he soothed, kissing the top of her head. It will probably take a few days to get back into the swing of things. We'll just take it slow. I've told the office that I'm taking next week off, and not to call me unless it was a world-ending emergency. Tonight we sleep, tomorrow we'll figure out in the morning. Now, close your eyes and sleep. I love you, Amelia whispered as she drifted off into a dreamless sleep. I love you too, Dale said softly, pulling her closer.
Chapter 23.
It took over a month for Dale to see any improvement in Amelia's mood. She was almost back to her old self. She'd began making plans to go back to the office, and even set up a coffee date with her best friend. Though he was concerned about how sick she'd been getting, she assured him all was well. It's just the change in food and water, she'd told him. It seemed she was throwing up a lot, but every time he asked her about it, she told him it was nothing. Dale, Amelia said, coming into the library, I'm going to meet Carol for coffee tomorrow morning. Do you mind? Not at all, darling, he replied, standing and walking to meet her. I think that is a wonderful idea. She's been calling here almost non-stop since I told her you'd been found. I asked her to give you time to acclimate and wait for you to call her, but are you sure you're feeling up to it? You've been getting sick quite a lot recently. She told me she'd talk to you, Amelia replied, taking his hand. Thank you. And yes, I'm feeling much better. What are you going to do while I'm out? Honestly, he said, his face turning slightly pink, I should probably head into the office for a few hours. My secretary's been fielding calls about a labor dispute one of my other clients has been dealing with, and I should really go in and deal with it. Maybe after coffee I can come to the office. And we can have lunch, Amelia ventured. I would love that, Dale said, kissing her hand in turn. Everyone's missed seeing you. Sounds good, she said, smiling. I've missed that, Dale sighed. What? She asked, confused. Your smile, he explained, reaching up to touch her cheek. I've missed your smile. I'm sorry, Amelia apologized, it's just been so hard. I know, he encouraged, and I don't want to push you too hard. If you're up to it, come by. If not, I'll see you for dinner. Sounds like a plan, she replied, standing on tiptoes to kiss him on the cheek. Amelia sat at her favorite table in Starbucks, sipping a decaf iced mocha while she waited for Carol to join her. Watching the hustle and bustle of downtown Houston, she mentally compared it to the quiet tranquility of sitting on the steps of Caleb's cabin hearing nothing but the sounds of nature. How different the two worlds were, she thought. One was where she grew up, the other was where she wanted more and more to return to. Hey you, Carol said, jogging Amelia out of her inner thoughts. Hey, Amelia breathed, standing to hug her dearest friend. They embraced for several moments before releasing each other. How are you? Carol asked, signaling for the barista. Dale told me you were having a hard time getting back on your feet. Yeah, Amelia sighed, waiting for Carol to order. It's been a little rough. I bet, Carol exclaimed, taking her coffee from the waitress. I mean, 6 months with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. No cell phone, no internet, hell, no electricity. It was tough at first, Amelia admitted. The absolute darkness once winter set in were hard, plus the constant dangers, but Caleb was patient and took the time to teach me. Was that his name? Caleb? Carol asked, sipping from her steaming cup. Yes, Amelia affirmed. Caleb Dulac. He used to be an Alaskan state trooper, but he spent the last several years living in the mountains. Wow, Carol exhaled, in awe. You were saved by a real-life mountain man. If you want to put it that way, Amelia chuckled. Yes, Caleb is a real-life mountain man. So, Carol said, leaning in conspiratorially, what was it like living in the middle of the woods with him? It was fine, Amelia shrugged, absent-mindedly swirling her drink with its straw. There were lots of things to learn, survival and trapping, even going to the bathroom required lessons. Lessons to go to the bathroom, Carol said, disgust and intrigue warring on her face. It was an outhouse, Amelia clarified, and there was always the possibility of hungry animals hiding anywhere. Shit, Carol breathed, that sucks. It did at first, Amelia admitted, but after a while it became a habit. I didn't even think about it, I just did it. Okay, Carol said, sipping her coffee and waving her hand in a sign of surrender. No more potty talk. Amelia gave a deep hearty laugh. All right, no more outhouse talk, she giggled. What else do you want to know? Tell me about Caleb, Carol said. What kind of guy gives up everything to go live in the woods? Caleb, Amelia sighed wistfully, picturing his face. Caleb is, well, he's complicated. He was working as a state trooper about 7 years ago when his partner was killed. He went through some really hard times, and he kinda gave up on life. His wife divorced him, took their daughter and moved back to her folks, and he moved to his valley. Alone. Wow, Carol breathed, that really sucks. Was he violent or mean? Living out in the woods, alone, no socialization, it's got to change a person. No, not mean, Amelia assured her friend. He was strict, but most of that was him trying to teach me to survive. Strict? Carol asked, a hint of mischief in her voice. Did he spank you? Carol, Amelia scolded, trying to hide the blush across her face. Oh my God, Carol exclaimed, sitting up straighter and looking intently into Amelia's face. You fell for him, didn't you? What? Amelia gasped, blushing a deeper red. You did, didn't you? Carol reiterated, you fell for him. Carol, please, Amelia begged, tears forming in her eyes. Don't say anything to Dale. He doesn't know, and I don't want him to. It will kill him. Amelia, her friend said, reaching across the table to take her hand. What happened to you out there? With a feeling of falling, Amelia told her friend everything, from the crash to her last wonderful night spent in Caleb's arms, to the child she was now carrying. Oh Carol, she sobbed, I don't know what to do. In the beginning all I wanted was to get home to Dale, and now all I want to do is go back and be with Caleb. I still love Dale, but not the way I used to. He's so kind and gentle, but I can't explain it, she hiccuped. I don't want to be with him anymore. Amelia, Carol consoled, I don't know what to say. Have you tried talking to Dale about this? No, Amelia said, through her tears, I can't. Listen to me, Carol said firmly. One way or another something like this will always find a way to come out, like in say 8 months. It would be better if you told Dale sooner rather than later. I know you're right, Amelia said, dabbing her eyes with her napkin. I would just hate to break Dale's heart. And what if Caleb doesn't want me? Millie, Carol scolded, using a nickname she knew would irritate her friend. The man begged you to stay with him, pleaded with you, and you don't know how he feels about you. No, you're right, Amelia sighed, reaching for Carol's hand. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what to do. Dale and I have been engaged for 2 years, that's a long time to just throw away. Amelia, you know Dale loves, Carol said, but you two seem to just be together out of habit at this point. Carol, Amelia said, stunned. Don't Carol me, her friend retorted. We've known each other since high school, and I've always been honest with you. When you first started dating Dale, I doubted it would last more than 3 months. I mean, he's 10 years older than you, and it happened right after your dad died. I figured you were substituting one father figure for the other, but then I saw how happy you were together and realized I was wrong. Right, Amelia affirmed. I loved him and he loved me. Yeah, loved, Carol mimicked. In the beginning you were the perfect couple, there was really a deep love between the two of you, but in the last 2 years you guys have become more like coworkers than a couple. You both go to your offices every day, maybe have lunch together once a week, right? Then he stays at the office and you go home or to a charity event alone, making excuses for his absence and pretending everything's okay. Amelia tried to say something, but Carol cut her off. No, let me finish, she said, holding up her free hand. I've wanted to talk to you about it for a while, but you seemed fine with the way things were, and I was willing to let things be. Not anymore. I don't want to see you slip back into that pattern again. There's no future for you or Dale. Amelia looked down at her clasped hands as Carol finished. I know you're right, Amelia sobbed. I just don't want to hurt Dale. Which do you think is going to hurt him more, you staying with him out of guilt and obligation, while having another man's baby, or you being honest with him and giving him a chance to be happy too? Carol asked. Will you be there with me when I tell him? Amelia asked, looking beseechingly at her friend. Not a chance, Carol said, patting her hand, but I will pick you up for ice cream afterwards.
Chapter 24.
That night, Amelia cooked Dale's favorite dinner and gave the staff the rest of the night off. She put on his favorite dress and did her best to prepare herself for what she was about to do. Sitting at the table, adjusting and readjusting the silverware, she waited for Dale, but as usual he was late getting home. When he did arrive, Amelia was a bundle of nerves. Sorry I'm late, Dale said, rounding the table to kiss her on the cheek. I got stuck in a meeting. It's okay, Amelia assured him. I kept everything on warm. You pour the wine and I'll get dinner. All right, Dale said, picking up the bottle. Amelia took several deep breaths before she returned to the dining room carrying 2 plates. There she saw Dale, lit by candles, looking so dear, she almost changed her mind. Putting their plates down, she sat quickly and took a deep drink from her water cup, avoiding the wine glass. Are you feeling all right, darling? Dale asked, concern on his face. No, Amelia said, her voice shaking. There's something I've been needing to talk to you about for a while. It's all right, Dale said, caressing her cheek. You know you can tell me anything. I've been doing a lot of thinking since I got back, Amelia started, then stopped. Amelia, Dale encouraged, just tell me. When I was, she faltered. Caleb and I, we were intimate, Dale finished for her. Yes, she replied sadly, looking down at her hands. Amelia, Dale said softly, my dear Amelia, look at me. Dale, she said, looking at him through tears, I'm so sorry, I never meant for it to happen. I never meant to get pregnant. Amelia, he said soothingly, putting his arm around her shaking shoulders. It's okay. What? She hiccuped, looking up at him confused by the love and compassion in his voice. What do you mean it's okay? I'm pregnant and I don't want to get married. Amelia, I love you, Dale explained, moving so he could look Amelia in the face. But we both know our relationship hasn't been happy in a long time. But Dale, she said, shaking her head. I love you. I love you too, he assured her. And I will always love you, but answer me one question, and be honest. Do you love me the same way you love this Caleb fellow? I don't know, she sobbed, falling into his arms. Amelia, my dear Amelia, Dale said, wrapping his arms around like a protective parent. I have enjoyed the last few years we've been together. It's more than an old man like myself deserves, but you and I both know that our love was never meant to be anything more than the love of friends. No, Dale. I still love you, she said, cupping his face in her hands. I know, my darling, he said, but are you in love with me? Dropping her hands, Amelia shook her head slowly. No, I don't think I am, she admitted, not only to Dale, but to herself. Not like I love Caleb. Then, my dear, he said, rising, I have something for you. What do you mean? She asked, watching Dale as opened his briefcase. Well, he said, slightly shamefaced. I may have seen this coming, and I had your jet fueled and the pilot is waiting for your phone call. Before she could protest, Dale held up his hand. Don't try and deny it, he continued. I've come home many nights over last year to find you crying alone in our bed, and I know those tears were my fault. Since you've been back, I can see in your eyes how unhappy you are. Oh, Dale, she sobbed, I had no idea you knew about that. Amelia, he said, wiping the tears from her cheek, please believe me when I tell you that I love you, but we were never meant to be together, not as husband and wife. I will always be here for you, but I think you need to find out if there is any future for you in Caleb. Unable to articulate her feelings, Amelia just hugged him, this man who would have been her husband but instead was her dearest friend. Thank you, she sobbed into his shoulder. Listen, he said, pulling away, taking her chin in his fingers. If Caleb decides he doesn't want to be a father, please know I would be more than happy to be a loving uncle. Embracing him once more, Amelia kissed him deeply on the cheek, grateful for his solid presence in her life.
Chapter 25.
As the plane took off, Caleb screamed, a raw animal scream of loss and rage. He'd held in his anger since receiving the bill for damage he'd caused to his motel room, angrily handing the receptionist a bundle of cash before getting into his cab. He'd hoped and prayed that Amelia would be at the airport, ready to return to his cabin with him. He'd begged God for that, but in the end she'd gotten on another plane and gone back to Texas with her fiancé. Caleb screamed until his voice was nothing more than a whisper, and he could taste the copper of blood in his mouth. Collapsing onto his knees, Caleb held himself as he shuddered and cried, whispering her name over and over again. Amelia, Amelia, please come back. He repeated, until his voice was as lost to him as she was. He stayed there long into the sunlit twilight of the Alaskan night, hoping against all odds that a plane would crest the horizon and she would come running into his arms. When he finally made himself accept that she was gone forever, Caleb stood on unsteady legs and walked slowly into his cabin, shutting the world out. Lighting the lamp, he saw for the first time that Amelia had left her drawings behind, stacked neatly on the table with a note. Reverently, remembering the joy he'd gotten watching her draw, he lifted the bark and read, Caleb, please understand, if there was no Dale, no life, no responsibilities out in the world, I would have stayed. Nothing could have dragged me away from you, from our wonderful little cabin in the woods, but fate is not that kind. I will always cherish the time I spent here with you. It will be what I think of whenever I need to smile. You have given me so much, and for that I thank you. Please forgive me, Amelia. With trembling hands, he gathered up the drawings and Amelia's gloves. Crawling into his cold, empty bed, he held them close to his nose, inhaling her scent, crying himself to sleep. When he woke, Caleb's mind was ablaze with rage. Rage at an unfair world that had given Amelia to him only to take her away. He took the bundle of her drawings and gloves and laid them tenderly into his trunk, the place he locked all of his failures. Sitting on his bed, he stared at the delicate little flowers and birds that covered the box. In the past they'd reminded him of his daughter, or her laugh and her smile, but now their bright colors only seemed to mock him. With a growl of outrage, he hefted the trunk and wrestled it through the door out into the clearing in front of his home. Throwing it forcefully to the ground, he relished the sounds it made as it splintered, its contents scattering across the dirt. Still manic with overwhelming sadness, he grabbed his shovel and hurried into the woods, looking for the marker he'd left on top of the liquor he'd buried. With shaking hands he dug with the shovel, eventually getting on hands and knees, clawing at the ground, wanting the bottles more than anything else right at that moment. When his fingertips finally hit something hard, Caleb gave out a cry of triumph, pulling out a bottle of rye whiskey. Wrenching off the top, he chugged the amber liquid until the bottle was almost half gone. Carefully laying the first bottle aside, he kept digging, pulling 3 more bottles out before staggering back to his feet. Nursing the whiskey bottle, he moved back to the clearing and poured the liquor out of one of the other bottles before shattering it on the pile of debris. With righteous vengeance, Caleb struck a match and threw it on the pile. In a flash, the entire thing was blazing, sending embers into the bright Alaskan night. Slumping to the ground, he sat and watched as his once most valued possessions incinerated to ash. By the time it had burned himself out, he'd finished one bottle and was well into a second. Stumbling to his feet, Caleb turned to see a black bear standing at the edge of his clearing, its nose scenting the air. "Come on," he yelled, daring the animal to attack. "Come and get me." Having just eaten his fill of deer and berries, the bear opted to turn and run from the unknown creature yelling at him rather than start a fight it had no real interest in. "Fuck you," Caleb screamed at the unending sky. "Fuck you for bringing her into my life. And fuck you for taking her from me." Trudging back up the steps into his cabin, he looked around and realized that he couldn't stay there. Everywhere he looked reminded him of Amelia. Their bed, the chairs they'd sat in at every meal, she was everywhere. Grabbing his rucksack, he began blindly grabbing supplies, not caring if he really had what he needed to survive. Snatching up his rifle, he walked out into the wilderness, not bothering to look back.
Chapter 26.
Amelia's heart soared and her stomach plunged as the plane crested the last mountain ridge and she saw Caleb's valley below. The summer was ebbing now, covering the entire valley with lush green foliage. It looked so much more beautiful than she remembered. With her stomach twisting in knots, the plane cruised to a soft landing on the glistening surface of the lake. It had taken weeks to make sure her company could taken care of in her absence, and to arrange for the specialty supplies she'd ordered for Caleb to be held until she got back to Anchorage. Trying to get out of the supply plan, she had to ask the pilot for help, her legs cramping from being on a plane off and on for 2 days straight. "Thank you," she said, grateful to have the extra hand. "Should we start unloading?" the pilot asked, making sure Amelia was steady on her feet before letting her go. "Yes," she replied with a bright smile. "I'm gonna run up to the cabin and let Caleb know I'm back." "Caleb," Amelia called, running up to the cabin door, bursting inside. "Caleb, I'm back." Looking around, she saw that the cabin was closed up tight, its windows shuttered against animals, and all the supplies she and Dale had sent up before heading back to Houston were still stacked and crated between the cabin and one of the outbuildings. Looking in once more, she saw dust on every surface, as if Caleb hadn't been there in weeks. Turning back to the lake, she cast about, hoping to spot Caleb somewhere across the water or in the trees nearby. When she didn't see anything, she shrugged. He must be out on a long hunt, she thought, though finding the door unbarred but the windows shuttered made her uneasy. Caleb had always been strict about animal-proofing the cabin when they were going to be gone for more than a few hours, making sure everything was locked up tight. Why had he left the door unbarred? "Hey fellas," she called to the pilot and the crew she'd hired to help unload all the supplies she'd purchased. "Just unload the plane over there and you guys can take off." "Ma'am, are you sure you want us to leave you here?" the pilot asked, looking around at the expanse of wilderness surrounding them. "Yes," Amelia said, nodding vigorously. "I'll be fine. Caleb should be back any time. I'll see you in 2 weeks." After reassuring the crew at least 3 more times that she was going to be safe, Amelia waved happily as the plane took off, disappearing into the Alaskan sky. Once they were gone, she returned to the cabin and unshuttered the windows, letting the sunlight shine in. Rolling up her sleeves, she set to work turning Caleb's cabin into their home. She pulled boxes into the cabin, opened them, and set to work replacing broken, dented and chipped items. By the time she was done, there were new pots, dishes and cups on the shelves, a fresh set of skinning blades on Caleb's table and brand new sheets on the bed. Everything that she'd taken down, she repacked in the empty boxes and pulled back outside for the plane to take away when they came back. With a satisfied sigh, she lit the fire in the stove and began unpacking the fresh cans of food and filled the shelves. Looking around, she was happy with her progress and decided to tackle more chores in the morning. For now, she decided it was time to take advantage of the solar shower she'd assembled earlier that day. Amelia reveled in the warm water as it sprinkled over her sore, sweaty body, rinsing the dust and grime of a good day's work off, smiling as she pictured Caleb under the water with her, his hands exploring her body with soapy fingers. When the warm water ran out, she wrapped herself in a thick fleece robe and settled comfortably into one of the new Adirondack chairs she'd brought up in the plane. Running a brush through her hair, she hummed happily to herself. Never in her life had she felt so at peace. The only thing that was missing was Caleb.
Chapter 27.
Scruffy and unkempt, Caleb stared down the sight of his rifle. On the other end was a mountain goat, balancing precariously 50 feet above him on a rocky outcropping. With a last steadying breath, he exhaled and pulled the trigger. As the animal tumbled down the incline, Caleb smiled in satisfaction, relishing the smell of gunpowder and the resonating echo of the shot. Shouldering his rifle, he took a long drink from his flask, savoring the burning liquor as it slid down his throat. Since walking away from his old life, he'd become a much more efficient and deadly hunter. He wasn't just hunting to eat, now he was hunting to kill, not just the animals, but the rage inside himself. As he began the arduous trek down to retrieve the goat's skin and horns, he looked up as an airplane flew overhead, its flight path taking it in the direction of his valley. It wasn't a bush plane he'd seen before, and it looked as though it was getting ready to land. Had the troopers come to talk to him? Maybe the pilot's family had hired a salvage crew to retrieve his body. Cursing his luck, he decided to collect the entire animal instead of just the trophy parts of it. Anyone who came this far into the bush would be horrified to see he'd only taken the most valuable parts of the animal, not the meat. In Alaska, it was a crime to waste an animal like that, and until he'd come back without Amelia and given himself back over the alcohol, he'd honored that law. Since then, he'd just left the carcasses to rot. After 3 hours of hard climbing, Caleb finally reached the goat and with practiced fingers had it prepared and ready to transport it back to his cabin within the hour. He knew there was no rush. Anyone finding the cabin empty should honor the code of the wilderness and use nothing more than they needed until he returned. With the weight of the ram on his shoulders, he felt a little like his old self, though he was far from the place he'd been before Amelia entered his life. Being out in the wilderness, hunting without mercy had eased some of the pain he felt at her loss, but Caleb knew he would never completely heal from her leaving him. Her departure was different from when Lizzie left. That had hurt, but he'd know it was best for her and their daughter, but Amelia's had broken him in ways he'd never known he could break. Step by step, he trudged home, hating whoever it was who was forcing him to return to the one place in the world he didn't want to be. Hearing a propeller, he looked up to see the same plane now flying away from his valley. Damn it, he cursed, thinking how good it would feel to shoot the bastards down. He'd hauled this stupid animal for miles and whoever it was just fucking left. He thought about just dumping the animal and heading back out, but realized that if her was this close he might as well stock up on ammunition, supplies. Reshouldering the animal, he started the trek again, wanting to get to the cabin, grab what he needed and get the hell out again.
Chapter 28.
Smoke and the smell of cooking meat drifted from the chimney of his cabin, making Caleb curse softly under his breath. The plane had flown away hours ago, but it looked like someone had stayed behind and made themselves at home with his supplies. There were piles of boxes and crates littering the clearing. Stepping closer, he looked inside one of them and saw, to his increasing ire, the pots, pans and dishes from his house. Son of a bitch, he said under his breath as he dropped the ram and readied his rifle. This is my fucking house. Kicking the door open, Caleb didn't know what he expected to see, but the tableau he saw was definitely not it. Amelia sat in front of the stove, frozen in fear, her still wet hair hanging loosely down her shoulders. Amelia, he breathed, his gun dropping to his side, unable to believe it was truly her. Hi, she breathed, the shock of him crashing through the door leaving her unable to articulate anything more coherent. What are you doing here? He demanded, kicking the door shut behind him. She tried to reply, slowly rising from her seat. Before she could continue, Caleb dropped everything and crossed the space between them. He pulled Amelia into a crushing embrace, his lips crushing hers painfully, his teeth cutting her lips. Amelia, he breathed, holding her painfully by the face. Is it really you? Yes, she replied, gently stroking his disheveled hair. What happened to you? She asked, seeing the blood all over his clothes and hands, smelling the alcohol on his breath. What do you think? He replied angrily, stepping away from her. You chose him, he spat, ignoring all of the work she'd done, just looking for his extra ammo. But I'm here now, she said, her heart racing in fear. Why was he acting this way? Hadn't she come back? Why? He demanded, turning on her angrily. Did you feel like slumming it in the woods until you get tired of it and head back to civilization? Caleb, she choked, feeling like he'd slapped her. With a feeling of falling, Amelia pushed past him out into the Alaskan night. Staggering to the water's edge, she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. What was wrong with him? Their last night together had been so tender, so sensuous. He'd made her feel like she was his everything, but right now she felt like a discarded whore. Hating himself even more, Caleb swept the table clear of new dishes with his arm, shattering them all. Walking over the broken pieces, he shoved cans of food into his pack along with the extra ammunition. Stepping outside, he saw Amelia kneeling by the water, her body shaking as she cried. "Don't be here when I get back," he called, walking back into the wilderness, back to his limitless slaughter of innocents. Amelia turned to call him back, but it was too late. Caleb was gone, lost to her forever. Shivering, not from cold, but from shock, she finally managed to drag herself back to the cabin, seeing the wreckage he'd made of her gifts and hard work. Climbing onto the bed she'd prepared for her and Caleb to share, she wrapped herself in the new blankets she'd brought and cried herself to sleep. Caleb rampaged through the brush, drinking from one of the bottles he'd grabbed from his stash at the cabin. Why had she even bothered to come back? She'd made it clear that she didn't want to stay with him. Hadn't she said the entire time she was stuck with him that she wanted to go home? Now she was back, cleaning his cabin, throwing away his old things, replacing them with new. Weren't his things good enough? Stopping in his tracks, Caleb tried to shake the cobwebs out of his alcohol-addled mind. Amelia had come back and brought new dishes, pots and pan. Thinking, he even thought he remembered new blankets on the bed. "Fuck me," he said aloud, finally realizing the truth. She had come back for him. Turning around, he dropped everything and ran back towards his cabin, praying that it wasn't too late.
Chapter 29.
Reaching the cabin, Caleb found the door bolted, locking him out. "Amelia," he yelled, banging his fists against the wood. "Amelia, let me in." After what seemed like an eternity, he heard the bolt being pulled back, the door opening to reveal a rumpled, puffy eyes Amelia. "What do you want?" she asked, not opening the door completely. "I can't go anywhere until the plane comes back for me. Just let me stay here for 2 weeks, then I'll be out of your life forever." "Amelia," Caleb sighed, resting his throbbing head against the solidness of the door. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said those terrible things. Please," he begged, "let me in." Wiping her nose with her sleeve, Amelia stepped back, letting him come in. "Listen, Caleb," she said, holding her fluffy robe closed. "As soon as my pilot comes back I will leave, and you have your life back." "I don't want that life back," he said, taking a tentative step towards her. "Without you, I have no life," he breathed, his arm reaching for her. "I didn't think I would ever see you again," he sobbed, moving quickly to grip her arm. "Caleb," she gasped, surprised by his sudden movement. "I love you," he said, planting kisses all over her face. "Caleb," she breathed, needed him to understand. "I can't stay." "What?" he demanded, stepping back, looking as if he'd been punched. "Please listen," she urged, reaching to cup his face. "I can't stay here, in the mountains, with you." "Why did you bother coming back?" he asked angrily, slapping her hands away. "I came back for you," she replied, trying desperately to keep him calm, to keep him from leaving again. "I love you." "You love me," he scoffed, storming around the small room. "You love me, but not enough to stay." "I can't stay," she said, her hands clasped to her chest, pleadingly. "Why?" he demanded loudly. "Why won't you stay?" "I said I can't stay," Amelia replied hotly, angry that this was not the reunion she'd dreamed of. "Then, why can't you stay?" he demanded hotly. "I'm pregnant," she replied, her voice raised so she could be heard over his. "What?" he asked, his eyes looking her up and down. "Well," she sighed, slumping into one of the chairs. "We humped like rabbits for months on end, never taking any precautions. What did we expect?" "I didn't," he said, sitting heavily onto the bed looking at her. "I'm not asking for a commitment," Amelia said, reaching across the small distance to touch his knee. "I just thought you should know that you're going to be a father." "Amelia," Caleb breathed, taking her hand in his. "I've bought a house outside of Anchorage," she said, offering a gentle squeeze. "I know you love this life, and I would never ask you to give it up, but I can't have a baby out here. Whenever you make it to town," she assured him, "we'll be there for you." "No," he replied, taking his hand from hers, "you won't." "Oh," Amelia said, her heart sinking. "You won't have to wait for me," Caleb clarified. "I do love this life, but I love you more. I want to come back with you. I want to be with you and our child." Rising, Caleb pulled Amelia into his arms, his lips seeking out hers. No more words were exchanged that night as they explored each other's body over and over again, Caleb touching her stomach reverently.
Epilogue.
Amelia stood on the tarmac, waiting impatiently for the bush plane to crest the horizon. Though Caleb had made this trip several times over the last 5 years, she was never truly able to shake the memories that haunted her of her plane going down. Her dark thoughts were interrupted by the 4-year-old boy hanging onto her pant leg. "Pain," he yelled. "Pain." Looking to where he was pointing, she caught a flash of light as the setting sun reflecting off the plane as it began its descent. "Yes," she smiled, lifting the excited boy into her arms, "that's Daddy's plane." After the birth of their son Brooks, Caleb and Amelia had tried living in together, but it didn't take long for them both to realize that he was no longer cut out for a domestic lifestyle. He'd spent so many years in the wide open spaces of the Alaskan wilderness that even living on the furthest outskirts of Anchorage, it was still too close to civilization for him. When Brooks turned 1, he finally had to admit to Amelia that he couldn't stand it any longer. Thankfully, Amelia had seen the signs long before he said anything and had already set plans in motion. "I have a surprise for you," she'd said, taking his hand in hers. She'd led him to her office. Pulling out a small binder, she's handed it to him and waited as he read what was inside. On the first page of the binder, Caleb read words that brought tears to his eyes. Caleb Dulac, Alaska's best hunting guide. "What is this?" he'd asked, looking down into her beautiful eyes. "I know you haven't been happy for a while," Amelia had replied, leaning against the edge of her desk. "And I know you really don't like being a kept man, so I'm letting you go." Caleb had looked at her, his heart sinking at the thought of losing her. Amelia couldn't help but laugh, seeing his confusion. "I'm not divorcing you," she'd said, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around his waist, smiling up at him. "You're not that lucky. I am, however, telling you that I want you to be happy. So, I have started a small LLC that provides guided backcountry trips to hunters, wildlife photographers, and scientists with you as the guide." "What?" he'd asked, stunned by her words. "I want you to go," she'd explained, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Take as many jobs as you need to feel like your old self, but promise me you will always come home to me and Brooks." "I promise," he'd said, dropping the binder so he could pull his amazing wife into his arms. As the plane rolled to a stop, and its engines died down, Amelia finally let her son down. Without a backwards glance, the little boy ran into his father's waiting arms. "Daddy," he cried, as he was swept up into a bear hug. "Brooks," Caleb said happily, holding his son close. "I've missed you." "I missed you too, Daddy," the little boy said, tugging at Caleb's bushy beard. "You face is itchy." "Yeah," Caleb chuckled, running his fingers through the rough hair. "Do you think Mommy will make me shave it?" "Definitely," Amelia said, finally reaching her two favorite boys. "I've missed you," Caleb said, pulling her into a deep kiss.
The end.